I've been white-knuckling the steering wheel, literally, every time that I have to drive to work lately. You see, 3 nights ago, I was heading out to the remote research site that I work at, about an hour from the main regional highway. It's a dead stretch of road, miles of nothing but dense, overgrown scrub and narrow, winding gravel paths. I was about 40 minutes in when I hit a section where the road sort of narrows down to a single lane due to a collapsed embankment. There's a makeshift temporary signal there as well that's been active for a few weeks now. I pulled up and killed the engine to wait for the light. It was pitch black, no moon, and the forest around the road was dead silent. I was exhausted that day too, checking my mirrors out of habit when I saw something move in the tall brush off the shoulder. I initially thought it was a deer, but the movement was all wrong, too calculated and too low to the ground. My partner, who was actually in the passenger seat with me this day, suddenly stiffened and grabbed my arm. She didn't even scream. She just whispered, "Don't look at the window, just go." I glanced toward the passenger side. A person was on their hands and knees, crawling through the thick, dry grass toward the rear wheel. They were wearing a dark, heavy coat and a smooth, featureless white face covering. Not a mask, but like a piece of fabric almost, pulled tight with no cutouts. They were moving in complete silence, trying to get into the blind spot of the back seat. I didn't wait for the light. I slammed the truck into gear and I punched it through the red, tires spinning on the gravel as I tore away and everything. We didn't slow down for the next 20 miles too. We called the authorities from a gas station further up the line, but they were pretty vague, basically saying that they'd monitor the area, which we both knew meant nothing. The uncanny variable, if that's what you want to call it, that keeps me up at night, though, is what I saw in the side view mirror just before I cleared that embankment. You see, as I sped away, I looked back and saw the figure stand up fully. They weren't running after us. They were just standing there, perfectly still in the middle of the road, holding what looked like a long rusted steel spike. It was pointed upward like they were signaling something hidden deeper into the trees, which I interpret to mean that this person wasn't alone. We spent the next day checking the undercarriage of the truck for trackers or loosened lug nuts or anything that we could find. Thankfully, we didn't find anything, but I haven't slept more than an hour at a time since then. I can assure you, too, that it was not a prank. No one plays a joke like that in the middle of a wilderness corridor where you might not see another soul for 6 hours at least, in the middle of the night when it's completely dark like that. I was right to be shaken, I know that. And I guess the message here is trust your gut. Lock the doors, and if you're ever stuck in that spot again, then don't wait for the light to change. Just get out of there and drive. So I was doing some commercial plumbing work at a large water treatment facility for a few months, and basically I was replacing some valves, repairing some damaged lines, inspecting some pumps, and dealing with leaks that crawl through service areas that nobody else wanted to go near, stuff like that. The facility was absolutely enormous though, and a lot of it was pretty old too. There were sections that had been built decades earlier, and were only really ever accessed when something was wrong. Concrete tunnels ran underneath the main buildings, pipes disappeared into walls and floors, and there were entire rooms filled with equipment that hadn't been used for decades maybe. I was usually there during the day, but one particular job had to be completed overnight because shutting down the water system during operating hours just wasn't an option. That's how I ended up working there alone after midnight one day. The first night was pretty good too, but the second, it certainly wasn't. I was working in one of those older service buildings around 1:30 in the morning when I heard somebody walking behind me. I assumed it was another contractor, so I turned around, expecting to see someone there, and I saw an older man standing at the end of the corridor. He looked like he belonged there. Grey work pants, dark shirt, old boots. He wasn't wearing a hard hat though, which immediately caught my attention because that was a big no-no here. So I called out, "Hey, are you working in here, man?" He didn't answer. He just stood there looking at me. I figured that he might not have heard me over the pumps, so I walked a little bit closer and he turned around and started walking away. I followed him around the corner, but when I got there, he was gone. There was nowhere for him to go, though. The corridor literally ended at a locked maintenance door, and I knew that there wasn't another exit here. I checked the door anyway, but I confirmed that it was locked. I walked back to the main section of the building and eventually found the site supervisor and asked if another contractor was working in that part of the facility, but he said no. I described the guy to him, and he immediately asked me what time I'd seen him. When I told him, he just stared at me for a second. Then he said, "Probably one of the old maintenance guys." And although I didn't really know what to make of the disappearance, I just tried not to think about it too much. The next night, though, I saw him again, and this time he was standing beside one of the large inspection tanks. He was facing the concrete wall with his head lowered. I called out, he turned around, and then he pointed toward the floor, and I looked down and there was nothing there, and when I looked back up at him, again, he was gone. That one really freaked me out. I walked over to the spot where he had been standing, and there was a puddle of water on the concrete. That wouldn't have normally been that strange at a water treatment facility, except the water wasn't coming from a pipe. I checked every visible line in that area, and as far as I could tell, there was no leak. I crouched down and touched it at one point too, and it was absolutely freezing. I was surprised it wasn't frozen over, in fact, it was that cold. Again, I reported it to the supervisor, who told me that there was probably condensation coming through the concrete. That explanation was, well, sort of lacking, but I guess it was good enough for me. After all, I just wanted to get this job done and get the heck out of there. Until I found the wrench. So I was working inside another service corridor a few nights later when I discovered an old pipe that needed replacing, and the pipe was heavily corroded, so I had to sort of cut away a part of the insulation surrounding it, and something fell out of it. A literal wrench came out of this pipe, old, rusted, and covered in dirt. I picked it up, and I noticed something engraved into the handle. There was a name, and I confirmed with this supervisor that it was the same surname as the man that I had apparently been seeing. At least, he looked like that, is what the supervisor said. He was actually quiet at first, and he asked where I'd found it, and I showed him. He didn't want to discuss it in the corridor, and so instead he took me into the office and pulled up some old records. The man that I'd been describing had worked at that facility years earlier. He had been a maintenance plumber. He disappeared during an overnight shift, apparently, and nobody ever found him. The police were called, and there was a huge investigation. Hounds were called in and everything, but apparently the guy was just never found. According to the supervisor, there had been some kind of an accident involving one of the underground service tunnels as well, and they'd searched for days, but there was nothing there. And so, eventually, the investigation was closed as a cold case, and I asked him why he'd said the man was probably one of the old workers, and he didn't answer. Instead, he told me something that made my stomach drop a bit. The last person who had seen that missing plumber alive had reported seeing him walking toward the same service corridor where apparently I had found the wrench. I stopped going into that section alone after that. A few nights later, I was working near the main pump room when I swear to you that I heard someone knocking on a pipe. 3 knocks, and I assumed it was another worker. Then it happened again, only this time the sound came from inside of the wall. Then it happened again, and I put my ear against the pipe. 3 knocks. I stepped away, weirded out by everything that had been happening, and I followed the sound down the corridor. led to a section of wall that contained several large water lines. There shouldn't have been enough space behind it for anyone to stand. And I was staring at the wall when, I swear to you, that I heard a voice. It was very faint and almost like somebody speaking through several layers of concrete, but I clearly heard "turn it off." I stood there listening, then I heard it again. I had no idea what it meant. I called the supervisor in a bit of a panic, and he told me to just leave the area, and so I did. Believe it or not, too, the next morning, we discovered that one of the old pressure valves behind that wall had actually failed. If it had ruptured completely, it could have flooded the entire lower section of the facility, too. The supervisor arranged for the system to be shut down and the wall opened, and behind it was an old access cavity, and inside that cavity were several things. There was actually an old tool bag in there, a pair of boots, and a section of, plumbing equipment. Everything was covered in corrosion from top to bottom, and the supervisor immediately called the authorities. I asked him whether they had found anything else, and he said that he couldn't really tell me at this point. I assumed that they must have found remains or something, and for a while I tried to forget about the whole thing. Then, several weeks later, I was working on a completely unrelated plumbing job in another town. The building had nothing to do with the treatment facility, mind you, and I was underneath a sink replacing a valve when I heard 3 knocks from inside of the wall, and instantly I froze. I slowly stood up. There was nobody else in the room. I put my hand against the wall. It was cold to the touch, much colder than the rest of the room. And then I heard that voice again, barely audible, but "turn it off." Well, I packed my tools and I left that place for the evening after I finished what I had to do, and I didn't stick around. I've worked as a plumber for years since then too, and I've heard pipes knock, and I've heard water hammer, I've heard pressure changes make walls sound like somebody's hitting them. I know that buildings make strange noises, pipes in particular, but I have never heard anything like that voice, nor have I found an explanation for it. I handed in the old wrench to the supervisor after trying to keep it, but I don't know why I wanted to keep it, and I sometimes wonder about whether or not they found anything or solved that cold case. I haven't been able to get any information about it, and so, really, I'm totally in the dark here. I was working as a surveyor for a massive infrastructure project in the Scottish Highlands. My job was to map a series of drainage culverts along a remote stretch of road that hadn't been serviced, since I think the 70s or something. It was mid-November though, and I had a standardized route: drive 3 miles west of the base station, park at the marked stone cairn, and walk the perimeter of the adjacent bog to verify the runoff pipes. I pulled over to the cabin. I walked the 300 meters to the first pipe. The topography was pretty uneven there, and I spent about an hour checking the integrity of the pipe before walking back to the truck. When I reached the road, the truck was gone. I looked up and down the road, but it was nowhere. It was a single-track road as well, with passing places every quarter mile, I would say, and there was really nowhere for a vehicle to be hidden. So I started walking back in the direction of the station, not knowing what to do. After 30 minutes of walking, though, I passed the same stone cairn. I stopped. I hadn't turned around. I had been walking straight the entire time, and I checked my GPS unit. The signal was fluctuating wildly at this place. The screen read station 0.5 kilometers away, but the landscape around me was a dense, featureless slope of heather and wet moss that I hadn't encountered on the drive in, and there was no way that I was that close to the station. I turned back to the road and started jogging at this point. I covered the distance that I estimated to be about 2 miles in about 15 minutes. I eventually arrived at the base station office, and my truck was parked in the bay. I walked into the office. The logbook on the desk was open to my entry for the day, and under departure time I had written 9 a.m. The current time on the wall clock was 9:15 a.m. But I'd been gone for hours. The GPS track on my handheld device showed a straight line that suddenly looped back on itself for 4 miles as well, and then ended at the office. And honestly, there was just no explanation for the missing time or the geography that I saw while walking. I even checked the track's odometer, and it showed that I had traveled exactly the distance to the site and back, with no extra mileage to account for the loop. I haven't gone back to that sector since then, and I'm not intending to anytime soon. So I was camping with my family near a ridge in the Cascades in the early 2000s. We had hiked about 3 miles off the main trail to reach a high alpine meadow. It was late August, and so the light held until, well, maybe about 9 o'clock, I would say. Around noon on our second day, I wandered toward a dense thicket of log pole pines about 200 yards from our site. I found a clearing that wasn't actually on our map, and in the center of the clearing, there was a heavy-duty canvas structure. It looked like a modular storage unit, or maybe a really large play tent, reinforced with metal poles and everything. The fabric was pinned into the ground with steel stakes, but the frame inside had, well, for the most part, just collapsed. I walked closer, and that's when I noticed that the canvas was covered in narrow vertical perforations. They weren't ragged tears like a predator would leave, but they were more precise and clean-cut slits, all roughly about 6 inches long and evenly spaced. Scattered around the base of the structure were dozens of items: child's building blocks, a tricycle with the front wheel missing, a set of action figures, small-sized shirts, trousers, and a singular dirt-stained sneaker. These clothes and toys were methodically arranged, pinned to the earth in a sort of sprawling spiral that led directly to the tent entrance. There were no sleeping bags, no food anywhere, and no human tracks in the soft mud nearby, only indentations that looked like heel strikes almost, spaced about maybe 12 feet apart. I didn't touch anything. It looked creepy and very suspicious, and so I went back to the camp and got my older brother. We returned to the clearing, and he stopped dead at the tree line. He pointed to the tent. While we had been gone, the slits in the canvas had widened noticeably, and inside the flattened structure, there was now visible movement. The canvas was literally bulging and shifting. We saw what looked like maybe a shoulder press up against the material, only to withdraw immediately when we stepped closer. Then a hand, long and grey and thin, emerged from one of the expanded slits, fumbled in the spiral of toys, and gripped a small red block. It pulled it back inside, and the structure became perfectly still all of a sudden. Well, as you can imagine, we didn't get any closer. We booked it out of there and hiked it back to our site, grabbed our gear, and drove out of the mountains before sunset. We didn't immediately report it to the rangers. We were too preoccupied with just getting out of there. But eventually we did tell them, and apparently when they got there, there was nothing there. I have never been able to reconcile how that structure could contain movement like that without collapsing any further. I mean, all logic would suggest that if anything inside of it moved, it should have fallen over. Or that hand that we saw, and what the heck that thing was. I don't want to speculate as to what it was, because genuinely I have no idea. But I know what I saw, and I will stand by that for as long as I live. I work as a night shift logistics coordinator for a rail yard in the Pacific Northwest. The yard is vast, bordered on one side by a dense, unmanaged strip of old-growth timber that separates our tracks from the highway. Most of the guys refuse to walk that perimeter near the tree line, citing the same heavy feeling. A physical drop in the stomach sensation that hits as soon as you cross the gravel line into the shadows. Now, 3 months ago, I was inspecting a parked freight line about a mile deep into the yard. It was 3 in the morning and the yard was silent, except for the distant hum of the main line. I was walking alongside the chain-link fence that marks our property line when the temperature just sort of plummeted all of a sudden. The air became sterile and devoid of any moisture. It was like walking into a commercial freezer almost. I stopped and the ambient noise of the yard, the low electrical buzz of the signals, suddenly just cut out completely. That's when I sensed movement parallel to me on the other side of the fence. It was a massive presence too, pacing the tree line with a stride that covered significant ground. Whatever occupied the woods as well matched my speed exactly, staying concealed behind the vegetation there. I clicked my high-beam flashlight on toward the source, and the beam cut through the dark, and for a split second, I saw something. It was a cluster of jagged vertical shadows braced against a massive cedar tree. It looked like a tripod of limbs, impossibly thin and grey, anchored deep into the bark, and as the light hit it, the tree itself seemed to sort of vibrate, shedding a shower of pine needles and dead branches all over the place. I turned and ran back toward the yard light, seeing that. I didn't look back until I reached the switch house, but as I stood under the floodlights, I looked at my forearm, and the skin was covered in this fine white powdery residue. It was almost like bone meal or dried moss or something, even though I hadn't touched anything. Since then, the area near the tree line, it's become a bit of an exclusion zone, I guess you could call it, for the crew. We find deer carcasses there occasionally, completely clean, and the skeletons are stripped of any meat, lying in the open as if they'd simply just dropped in place. I've never seen anything like it. I've stopped going to that end of the yard. I don't care about the schedule or the efficiency reports. Personally, I think that some spaces in the world aren't abandoned. They're occupied by something that doesn't share our concept of geography. And every time that I pass that stretch of fence, I can still feel that static buildup in my hair and that silent warning that that perimeter is being observed. So, I'm a commercial diver, and most of my work involves underwater welding and structural inspections on deep-sea oil rigs. The work, as you can probably imagine, is very isolated and requires absolute focus on the telemetry provided by the service crew. Last Tuesday, I was performing a routine weld on a support pylon about 150 feet down. The visibility was roughly 4 feet, and I was working in a pressurized bubble, the comms line feeding me audio from the deck. For nearly 20 minutes as well, the feed was perfectly clear, just the mechanical breathing of the compressor and the occasional muffled update from the foreman. Then the feed suddenly cut to a continuous high-pitched frequency. It was sort of rhythmic, oscillating every few seconds, sounding remarkably like a distress beacon. Yet it lacked the digital consistency of a manufactured signal. It almost sounded organic, like a vocal cord being strained beyond its physical limit. I paused my work, staring into the silt, and in the periphery of my lights, I caught a glimpse of movement. It was a massive pale shape, elongated and segmented, drifting between the support beams. It didn't swim. It almost seemed to hold its position against the current with zero effort. The audio feed shifted again. The high-pitched frequency ceased, replaced by a clear, unmodulated human voice. It was a woman's tone, entirely devoid of inflection, cycling through a series of technical measurements that were pretty much irrelevant to my current depth. It repeated the depth and the coordinates of my location 10 times as well, before the connection went completely dead. When the comms died, the darkness, it suddenly intensified beyond anything I've ever seen before. And that was when I saw it. directly below my position, resting on the seabed floor, was a perfect glowing sphere of what I can only describe as amber light. It wasn't casting rays, it was emitting a steady internal luminescence that pulsed with a slow sort of cadence. It looked like a lens focused on the pylon when I was working, and I didn't wait for the surface crew for a signal. I aborted the dive immediately, manually overriding the decompression sequence, and as I ascended, the water around me darkened even more. Schools of deep-sea snapper, usually indifferent to divers, swarmed past me in a chaotic and desperate surge toward the surface. I reached the platform deck in total silence. My foreman was staring at the comms console, and he hadn't sent the audio that I'd heard. In fact, he claimed that for the entire duration of my dive, the comms channel had been broadcasting nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I handed in my gear and I didn't wait for my pay. I'm currently driving north, away from the coast. The pressure in the water was the least of my concerns as well. It was obviously the realization that that light beneath me, it wasn't normal. And I think that it had been watching me the entire time. I work as a night watchman for a series of commercial avocado orchards. The property is absolutely huge, divided into blocks by steep gullies and dense stands of remnant rainforest that haven't been touched since the land was cleared for farming in like the 80s or something. My shift involves driving a heavy utility vehicle along the interior tracks to check on the irrigation pump stations. Last Thursday, I was near the northern perimeter, and it was a section that sort of backs into a deep limestone ravine. The air was pretty thick there with the humidity typical of Queensland summer evenings, and I had stopped the vehicle to clear a fallen branch from the track, a chore that I had done dozens of times without any incident. But as I stepped out of the cabin, the atmosphere sort of shifted. It wasn't the usual quiet of the bush. It was an absolute absence of any sound at all. The cicadas, the nocturnal birds, even the rustle of the leaves in the breeze, everything stopped at once. The air felt pressurized, as if I was standing at the base of a canyon, even though the terrain was relatively flat here. I walked to the branch anyway, but I stopped about 10 feet short of it. My skin crawled all of a sudden, a physical reaction to a sudden spike in like static electricity all around me. I scanned the tree line, but the shadows were impenetrable here. Then there was this vocalization that started. It didn't come from the forest. It felt like it originated from the space immediately behind my left ear. It was a single word: wait. It wasn't a request. It was a demand, delivered in a really flat way, without any human inflection. I didn't turn around. I pivoted, vaulted back into the vehicle, and reversed without checking the path behind me. But as I pulled away, a sound erupted from the tree line. It sounded like layers of metal grinding against each other and screeching off of shearing steel. The sheer volume of it forced me to jam my hands over my ears as I drove as best as I could, and I didn't stop until I reached the main office on the other side of the property. I mean, I was completely panicking. I didn't report it to the owners. They're investors who live in Brisbane, and they just honestly wouldn't understand. I'm still doing my rounds, but I certainly stay inside the vehicle anywhere around that location now. I keep the windows rolled up and the door's locked, and I know that the bush is still there, but I no longer feel like the person who owns the right-of-way. These days, in that location, I feel more like a guest waiting for the silence to return. So I'm a freelance wildlife surveyor, working on land reclamation projects in the high deserts of New Mexico. The job basically involves installing motion-activated cameras in remote, unmapped sectors to sort of track animals and whatnot. I've spent the better part of a decade working solo, and I'm pretty well acquainted with the occasional erratic behavior of local animals. But 2 weeks ago, I was working in a sector that hadn't been logged for like 50 years or something. I had set up a base camp about 6 miles from the main access road, and the first incident occurred at about 2 in the morning. So I was inside of my tent when the ambient noise, which was basically the constant sound of crickets and whatnot, it just suddenly stopped. It didn't fade. It was like it was just cut off all of a sudden. It was so weird, in fact, that I stepped out, expecting to see a mountain lion or a bear that had spooked the local insects, but the clearing was empty. But then, about 40 feet away, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the scrub or the brush there. It was upright, humanoid in silhouette, but its limbs were sort of segmented, bending at angles that looked like rusted iron hinges. It wasn't moving forward. Instead, it was sort of twitching, snapping its joints forward and back in a motion that reminded me a lot of glitching video loops. When I shined my light on it, the beam didn't illuminate the skin or fur of it. It seemed to almost be absorbed by this shape, as if the object were made of negative space. I scrambled to my truck, but the ignition wouldn't turn. I sat there breathing hard, trying again and again, until the engine finally kicked over. And as I backed out, I saw the shape again. It had moved to the driver's side window, standing motionless, its height towering over the roof of the truck. I didn't stop to take a closer look. In fact, I didn't stop until I reached the paved highway. Now, the second incident, that happened yesterday while I was retrieving one of the camera arrays. I was about 3 miles into the desert when I heard a sound emanating from the rocks ahead. It sounded like somebody muffling something under their breath. It was structured sentences almost, and sounded human, but sort of off at the same time. I didn't stop to verify where it was coming from or the source or anything. I didn't even pack up the camera hardware in the end. I left the gear where it was, and I instantly just turned around and noped it out of there. I've since pulled out of that sector, and my boss asked why I abandoned the equipment, but I told him that the terrain was too unstable to continue there, and honestly, I just lied about it. I don't wear protective talismans or anything, and I don't consider myself a believer in anything beyond what I can really measure, but I know what I heard that day and also what I saw, which is a part of the reason why I'm here. I know what I saw and I know what I heard, but I have absolutely no idea what they are. It's weird too, right, that one happened right after the other? Do you guys have any idea as to what any of this could be? I'm finishing up my final semester at a community college in the rural outskirts of the state that I live in, staying in an old off-campus rental house while I grind out my last few credits. The place is cheap because the landlord never fixed the radiator, and the pipes under the floorboards make this constant shifting sound that keeps me up all night, but I usually keep my headphones on while I study at the kitchen table, which sits right in front of the bay windows facing the main road. Still though, the math on the room was off. I noticed it around midnight while I was reviewing my lab notes one day. The window is supposed to show the driveway and the gravel patch leading on the street, but the reflection in the glass just didn't align with the exterior lights. I saw movement in the pane, 3 distinct shadows darting between the trees. But when I looked out through the clear glass, the driveway was empty. I took off my headphones and listened for a bit. I didn't hear anything. There was no gravel crunching, but the air inside the kitchen felt heavy. I went to the back door to check the bolt, but when I reached out for the frame, I felt the wood sort of, shifting under my fingers. It wasn't like the house settling or anything, too. It was weird. It was like it was moving. I went to the living room and looked out the side window. There was a grey sedan idling at the edge of the property line, its lights completely dark. The engine wasn't running, but the exhaust pipe was puffing out thick black clouds that dissipated instantly into the air. I didn't call the police because the nearest station is 20 minutes away, and by the time that they got out there, the road is going to be empty anyway. Plus, what am I going to say? There's a car outside and there's shadows moving about. No one's going to take that seriously. So instead, I grabbed my laptop bag and my keys from the hook, trying to keep my breathing steady. I knew I couldn't just walk out the front door, so I headed for the utility closet that leads to the crawlspace exit. But as I passed the hallway, I saw the handle on the front door moving. It was turning. It wasn't forced. Instead, it was turning slowly and methodically, as if somebody was trying to find the right key for a lock that didn't exist. I didn't stop. I dropped into the crawl space, crawled through the dust and the old insulation, and I kicked the latch on the exterior access panel and got out. I pushed out into the tall grass of the backyard and I ran for the neighbor's property, not stopping until I hit the porch lights. When I looked back at the house, the front door was now standing wide open, even though I knew that deadbolt had been engaged. I stood at the neighbor's until dawn. When I went back with the landlord to get my books, the inside of the front door was covered in thousands of tiny, sort of shallow scratches, and as far as I could tell, there was absolutely nothing missing. Which begs the question, if these people were not breaking in to steal things, then why were they breaking in? So I took a seasonal position last year as an assistant at a remote maritime research outpost. Bit of a mouthful, I know, but that's what the position was. The site that I was at is a series of converted shipping containers on a jagged section of the coast. My supervisor, a project lead named Sarah, was constantly juggling grants and struggling to keep the facility running. So she decided to hire a freelance engineer, I'll call him M, to help with the heavy equipment maintenance. M was looking for a temporary workspace and a place to stay while he worked on his portfolio, and Sarah, needing the extra budget for repairs, agreed to let him use the secondary bunk in the workshop. I didn't spend much time with him, but he did make the space feel a bit off-kilter, I guess you could say. He was quiet, but he had a way of sort of watching the tide charts for hours, his hands absolutely still. I found his supply bin in the galley, filled with dozens of specialized heavy-duty soldering components and unlabeled industrial reagents. It didn't make much sense for his workload and what he was doing, and the volume of it was weird. I was definitely a bit jumpy around him, especially since I was the only other person out there at night. I remember keeping a heavy wrench under my pillow. I know, it felt ridiculous to me too, but having a cold weight like that nearby, well, it helps you sleep. Anyway, Sarah was also uneasy, mostly keeping him at arm's length. She'd say that he was highly specialized, but she never let him work alone in the main server room. For the first month, it was pretty much routine as well. He did the grunt work and he kept to himself, but during the second month, things sort of shifted a bit for him. M stopped following the maintenance logs. He started making these intense technical observations about the local water currents and how the station's foundation interact with the tide. He'd mutter about how the structure just wasn't sitting right, implying the station was somehow leaking information into the sea. It wasn't just weird, it was honestly just sort of completely irrational. The remarks too, they grew more frequent, more detached from the actual work that we were doing. Sarah eventually started keeping him out of the main operations area during my shifts. Then, I showed up one morning and M's equipment was cleared out. Sarah told me that he was gone. Things had apparently peaked while I was on a supply run. He'd gone on a rant about Sarah sabotaging the station's mooring to drown the team apparently, claiming that he saw the math behind her plan. The argument became aggressive, and he refused to vacate the bunk, and Sarah had to call the Coast Guard to forcibly remove him in the end. After that too, I was sort of terrified every time that I walked to the docks for weeks, imagining him hiding out in the tall grass, waiting to confront us. But thankfully, he never did return. His former partner came later by to pack his gear and he just sort of vanished from our lives. That is, until about 3 months later, when a regional news ping hit my inbox. M was in the headlines. He'd stopped his maintenance work and his routines, and apparently he'd walked into a major communications hub in the city with a heavy-duty industrial cutter, and he started shearing through the structural support beams of the server housing, then sprayed a highly flammable solvent over the central processor racks and lit them up. One technician was trapped in the server cage and unfortunately died from the smoke. M then severely injured a security guard with his equipment before he was tackled. He had absolutely no connection to those people, mind you. They were complete strangers in a building that he had no reason to target. He's in a high-security ward now, apparently, but I still think about it when I'm out on the coast sometimes. It's hard to reconcile the man who worked in our workshop with the person who committed those crimes, if I'm being completely honest. I think in the end, we were just lucky that he wasn't there when he finally reached his limit. So I was working in this building located in a quiet, older commercial district. The office was on the second floor, overlooking a wide, sort of paved utility lot that was usually empty after business hours. During a slow season, I was spending a lot of time documenting the exterior perimeter, so I became very familiar with the regular flow of the traffic there. Around that time, I noticed a dark blue sedan parked near the perimeter fence every morning. It was an older model, and it never moved for hours at least. I didn't recognize it as belonging to any of the staff or the local delivery contractors. I started keeping a mental note of it though, just because the repetition felt odd for such a dead-end parking area. Anyway, I started checking the lot from the upper story window during my mid-morning breaks. The driver never exited the vehicle. He would sit there completely still for 3 or 4 hours and then just simply drive off again. I went through the usual checklist. Maybe he is a site surveyor, maybe he's waiting for a meeting, or maybe he's just someone killing time. Who knows? But after a week of the same routine, the lack of activity started feeling weird. One afternoon I used the telephoto lens on my camera to get a better look at the guy too. What I saw made my stomach twist. Through the glass I could see the passenger side of the windshield wasn't clear. It was covered in some sort of dry brownish smears that looked like old mud maybe, and they formed a pattern. A tight, repeated pattern of swirling lines and tiny symbols scratched into the film of the dirt, facing inward toward the window. He also wasn't just sitting there, he was looking through those symbols. Then, one day my supervisor pulled into the lot earlier than his usual schedule, and as soon as his vehicle cleared the gate, the blue sedan accelerated and just vanished. It was hours ahead of the man's usual departure. It could have been timing, but it certainly felt targeted. I decided to shift the dynamic. Instead of watching from behind the glass, I started taking my breaks right by the main gate in plain view. I'd walk out with my logbook and pen, making sure to deliberately look toward the car. I'd spend 10 minutes just standing there, documenting the weather or filling in notes, while glancing over to establish that I was seeing him. After a few days, I escalated it too. I brought out a folding stool, sat down near the entrance, and focused my attention directly on the sedan. I wanted him to know that the observer had become the observed. We'd catch each other's eyes through his windshield from time to time, across the field of those strange scratched symbols, and every time that he'd avert his gaze looking down at his lap or the steering wheel, I'd consider walking over to confront him, but the thought of that window stopped me. After 4 days of this, suddenly, that car just didn't show up. He never came back to the lot, too. I never found out who he was or what he was doing, but I still wonder if he realized that he had lost his anonymity and decided that the quiet stakeout wasn't worth the trouble of being watched right back, or if the plans that he had been somehow squashed by my presence. What do you guys think? So I took a job last month as the graveyard shift for a watchman position at a remote Forest Service trailhead. The site is very isolated, with 3 staff cabins clustered together, maybe 20 feet apart I would say, but total privacy is pretty much non-existent when you have other people there. I was working solo shift on a 3-day rotation, staying in the middle unit. It's supposed to be a quiet post, just monitoring the gear shed and the logbooks and making sure nobody comes in or out without seeing them. My first night was slow as well. Around midnight though, while doing a perimeter check with a flashlight, I spotted a dark car idling about 100 yards up the access road. It had no lights, and as I walked toward it to check for unauthorized parking, it crept forward, then accelerated and vanished into the timber. I didn't think too much of it at the time. Maybe just a lost traveler or somebody stopping who knew they shouldn't have been there and so they took off when I got close, whatever. On the second night though, things felt a bit different. A guy, his name is Elias, had been hanging around the trailhead since dusk, claiming that he was waiting for a ride that never really showed up. He was erratic, his eyes darting around constantly, pupils blown wide, slurring his words about how the forest was crawling with hidden microphones. Yeah, he was clearly on something. Anyway, around 11 p.m., he cornered me near the shed. He started insisting that I walk down the trail to his parked vehicle, claiming that he had gear that he wanted to show me. He got aggressive too when I refused, his voice dropping, threatening that he'd make me look if I didn't comply. When he started reaching into the oversized pockets of his jacket, my gut instantly told me to move. I feigned a radio call to the main office, telling him that I had to meet a patrol unit, and retreated into my cabin, locking the heavy door behind me. I stayed awake, weapon at hand, for hours. And around 3 a.m, a soft scratching started on the cabin wall near the window. I didn't look because I knew what it was. Instead, I waited, holding my breath, and a low voice drifted in through the screen. He said, "I know you're in there. I'm just coming in to get your keys." At this point, I didn't argue. I didn't warn him. I stood up and drove the bolt back, throwing the door open with my light aimed straight at his face. And he was standing there, but his fingers were locked into the wooden siding, nails bent back and bleeding, literally bleeding into the cedar, seemingly stuck in the grooves that he'd been digging. He stared at me for a second, his face pale and slack, then scrambled backward and literally bolted into the tree line. That was enough for me. I called the authorities and they came out and searched for the guy, but they never did find him. Still though, the officers did see the video footage of the security cameras there, and they saw him doing everything that I described, and said that he hadn't really done anything illegal, so there wasn't really much that they could do. They said that they would keep an eye out, but I have been wide awake every single night ever since that night. I still don't know what he was doing to that wall, but the sound of those nails catching in the wood, man, it's stuck in my head forever, I think. It's horrible to think about. So, Elias, or whoever you are, I really hope that we don't cross paths ever again. So I live in a detached unit at the end of a very long, overgrown service road, with nothing but open brush between my front door and the main perimeter. I'm 29, my partner is 31, and we have a senior dog who's usually pretty quiet. But last night, that all changed. Around 10 p.m., my partner came in from the garage, and I heard him mutter something before slamming the door and locking it. He told me that a man had just walked right into our mudroom. My partner assumed it was a delivery driver or a lost neighbor and chased him off, leaving the door unlocked again because he still hadn't shaken the habit of leaving the place open. We brushed it off, but the dog actually spent the night whining, pacing by the door pretty much every hour. At 4 in the morning, the dog started throwing himself against the wood, barking like he was fighting something off. Then came the pounding. It wasn't a knock, it was a heavy thud, and my partner shouted through the door. The man on the other side started screaming that his wife was inside, that she'd abandoned her faith and was hiding in our unit. It was incoherent, rambling stuff about spiritual cleansing. We called the police. The guy vanished into the woods, and the officers told us to call back if he returned. And he came back about an hour ago. I could hear him shuffling through the dry brush right outside of our bedroom window, in fact, whispering to himself. The police came and they pushed him off of the property line, but they told us that they couldn't arrest him because he technically hadn't entered the structure again. One of the officers mentioned that he was just released from the county for trespassing at a neighboring facility, apparently. The terrifying detail, though, is that while I was looking out of the blinds at the tree line, I saw what he was doing while he shuffled. He wasn't just pacing, he was holding a small handheld mirror, tilting it up toward our bedroom window, trying to catch the light from our lamp and bouncing it back into the room like he was trying to look at us without showing his face. Honestly, too, I'm pretty terrified to leave for my shift in the dark now, and I'm also terrified that if we call the police again, that we'll just wait for them to clear the scene before slipping back to the window. If he's already been in jail for this too, then he knows exactly what he's doing. We've moved the heavy desk in front of the door, but the walls are pretty thin here, and he knows that we're in here as well. We're packed at the moment and waiting for sunlight because we're leaving the keys on the counter and getting to a hotel as soon as it's light. This isn't just an intruder, it's a fixation of some sort, and we're being targeted for whatever reason. And it's pretty terrifying knowing that there's nothing that we can do or the police can do until something happens. So I was 12 years old, out on a family excursion in a remote section of the high desert. My parents and a few family friends, I was setting up a temporary base camp about 1/4 of a mile off the main logging road, buffered by a dense wall of pines. The terrain was wide open here as well, mostly sagebrush, dry grasses, and loose shifting rock. Late one afternoon, I was exploring the perimeter, just wandering through the brush and humming to myself. I wasn't far from the road, maybe 50 yards, when a weathered utility truck pulled over, its engine ticking as it idled. 2 men were in the cab. They rolled down the passenger window and gestured for me to come closer, asking me for directions to a trailhead that didn't even exist in that part of the county. The air around me suddenly felt wrong too, even at that age. There was a thin and sort of static charge to the whole thing. My stomach hit the floor and I started backing away, but both men stepped out of the truck, their movements coordinated and predatory. They started calling out, repeating, "It's fine, we're just lost. Step over here and show us on the map." Just as one of them began to walk toward me, a sharp metallic clack echoed through the trees. My father, who had been glassing for game from a ridge overlooking the camp, had seen the truck pull over. He stepped out from the tree line, his heavy hunting rifle slung over his shoulder, and whistled loudly. He didn't even yell, he just stared them down. The men froze, looked at my father's silhouette against the ridge, scrambled back into the truck and tore out of there, leaving a cloud of dust and the smell of burnt rubber in their wake. The terrifying detail, though, wasn't just them coming at me. While I was backing away, I noticed the back of their truck bed, and it wasn't empty. It was filled with dozens of discarded, mismatched mannequin heads, all spray-painted a dull uniform grey. They were piled high as well, rolling against the tailgate as the truck accelerated, their featureless painted faces staring directly at me as they sped away. I still have nightmares about those grey blank faces, and I know that my father saved me that day. They obviously were not looking for a trailhead. They were looking for a collection instead. And if it hadn't have been for my father that day, I honestly don't think that I would be here. I took a temporary gig helping a friend manage her small boutique property while she was traveling for a week. The building is in an older but rapidly changing commercial district, the kind of place where high-end lofts sit right next to derelict boarded-up storefronts. The property itself is a converted warehouse unit. Plenty of charm, but the security was pretty much non-existent. The main entry door actually had a very temperamental lock to it, and the floor-to-ceiling windows had flimsy latches that basically did nothing. I'm in my 30s, fairly street-smart I would say, and generally unbothered by neighborhood turnover. I settled in my first night, watching a film in the main lounge. The space felt exposed, of course. The curtains didn't quite meet in the middle, leaving a thin vertical strip of glass that looked out directly onto the dark alley. And sometime around 2:45, I would say, the silence was shattered by heavy thudding against the entry door. I instantly froze. I waited. It came again, slow and deliberate and heavy. I crept toward the door, which had a small reinforced viewing pane, and a man stood there. He was drenched in sweat, wearing a thick, heavy parka, despite the sweltering heat, and his eyes were darting around as if he were tracking movement in the air. He didn't ask for help. He just rasped, "Is your husband home?" I knew immediately that he wasn't checking for a friend. He was testing for occupancy. I lied and said yes, loudly shouting into the empty loft as if someone were in the back, then retreated to the bedroom, pulled the dog inside, and locked myself into the closet with my phone. The police, they arrived within 15 minutes, but they only found flattened footprints in the landscaping where he had been pressed against the glass. I left for my own place shortly after that, but when I debriefed with the owner, she just sort of dismissed the whole thing. She called him the local weirdo and claimed that he had been asking for water or cash for weeks, and she thought that it was a social issue, not a predatory one. But the thing that convinced me that this wasn't just a confused, transient person occurred while I was pulling the dog into the bedroom. So I had grabbed the dog's water bowl from the kitchen floor, right near the window, and as I reached down, I saw it. The man hadn't left after I called for my husband. He was still standing in the alley, but he had pulled a small shiv or knife or something from his pocket. He was holding it steady and staring directly at the door. I think that he knew that I was alone, but thankfully he didn't act. I don't know if he would have broken in if I hadn't have called the police, but I think that he was performing surveillance to ensure that his path was clear. I guess the moral of the story here is that if you ever find yourself in a house with rickety security, don't listen to people who say that it's all fine and safe and everything. And when someone asks about other people in the house, I would say that they're probably doing it as an audit to the danger level if they do break in. You're not overreacting. You're reading the intent correctly, and you need to get out of there before the audit is complete. Trust that instinct, because if a situation feels like a stakeout, well, it probably is. I worked a high-pressure sales gig at a regional distribution center, managing a territory that required me to be on the road constantly. I was mid-20s, juggling a pretty heavy schedule, when a guy from one of our partner firms started sort of inserting himself into my periphery. It began with casual messages through professional networking sites. He had a connection to somebody that I knew, so I was initially polite. When it became clear that he was trying to push into my personal life, I gave him a standard firm rejection. He didn't take the professional boundary very well, though. He sent a long, rambling voice note that I never opened, and then went silent. That was obviously the first red flag. He had claimed in his initial messages that he'd been observing my trajectory for years, noting my work hours and my family's location and things like this. I blocked him on every platform immediately. But then came the physical escalation. 3 times this week, I've seen the same marked fleet vehicle parked near the exit ramp of my facility at the exact same time that I punch out. It pulls into the traffic the second that I pass it, and because the fleet uses interchangeable high-rotation plates, I can't pin it down for the authorities, but the timing is always precise. He isn't just in the area, he's timing his movements to my shift for sure. The psychological toll that this is having on me is really heavy too. I'm constantly hyperventilating, checking the rear view and planning exit routes, everything. My family keeps telling me to document every occurrence, but keeping a log feels like a secondary trauma. It's just confirming that I'm being hunted while I wait for a crime to actually occur. The thing that pushed this from annoying to dangerous, though, happened yesterday. So I had stopped at a public restroom about 20 miles from my job, trying to shake the feeling of being followed. I went into a stall, and when I looked down at the metal partition, I saw it. A series of handwritten numbers etched deep into the steel with something sharp. They were coordinates, and underneath them, in the same frantic deep gouge, was my own license plate number, perfectly rendered. He hadn't just been watching me, he had been marking locations that I frequent, likely waiting for a moment when I was truly isolated. This is classic predator behavior, I know that. They manufacture a sense of history to force a false intimacy, and when you reject it, they switch to intimidation to maintain control. This is stalking. The offense he feels is a tactical choice to make me feel guilty for existing outside of his control. I'm trying to stay away from him, but at this point, I think that I need to contact the authorities. I took a trip to a restored manor house in a remote region of the French countryside when I was about 20 years old. It was a sprawling, stone-built property, the kind that feels grand but inevitably has drafty corners and sort of odd layouts. I was traveling with 2 friends. We had booked a suite on the 2nd floor. It was a strange setup too, a front common area that led into 2 bedrooms, one of which featured a heavy floor-to-ceiling antique mirror mounted on a track against the back wall. One afternoon, I stayed behind to catch up on some work while my friends went into town. I was sitting in the front room when I heard a faint sort of rhythmic scraping coming from the 2nd bedroom. I assumed it was the staff. We'd reported a faulty window latch earlier that morning, in fact, and the caretaker had mentioned someone would be up there to handle it. A moment later, the door connecting the 2 rooms creaked open. A man walked in. Not the caretaker that I'd seen earlier, but somebody else, moving with a strange and heavy gait. He looked at me, muttered something unintelligible, and walked right past me to the exit through the main suite door. I was a little bit shaken, mostly because I hadn't heard him knock or use the suite's main entry. Curiosity got the better of me. I checked the 2nd bedroom, which was empty. I walked over to the standing mirror, and I nudged it. It swung inward on a hidden hinge, revealing a narrow, damp spiral staircase carved directly into the stone, plunging into the dark beneath the floorboards. There was no door, no barricade, just a thin gap of cold air and the smell of wet earth. When I confronted the owner, she was very dismissive, claiming that it was her husband checking the structural integrity of the wall behind the mirror. She made it sound like a mundane maintenance task, but the maintenance didn't explain why he'd entered through a tunnel instead of the hallway. The part that still haunts me, though, however, is what I saw when I pushed the mirror back into place. As I turned to leave, I noticed a series of fine, needle-like holes drilled in through the silvering of the glass, all clustered near the eye level of someone who could potentially be standing in the bedroom. I realized then that that mirror wasn't just furniture. It was a viewing port. He had been standing in that dark, narrow shaft, staring through the glass to see if the room was empty before he stepped out. Obviously, I don't know exactly what the owner's husband was doing in that tunnel, but I'm pretty confident that it wasn't maintenance. And if a room like this has a hidden passage that allows someone to bypass the main door, well, you're not a guest anymore, you're an exhibit. We packed our bags and we left that evening. I was living alone in a basement-level studio apartment at the time that this happened, the kind where the windows sit right at grade level, looking out at the feet of anyone walking past. It was 2 a.m, a Tuesday, when I woke up to the sound of heavy thumping against my front door. It was not a knock, it was the sound of a literal shoulder being thrown against the wood. My unit was cramped and poorly lit, with only one exit. I didn't turn on any lights. I crawled to the door and peered through the eye hole, and a man that I didn't recognize was standing there, drenched in sweat, his face contorted in a mask of aggressive confusion. He was shouting at the door, demanding that I open the gate. He then moved on to my neighbor's door, screaming, then circled back around the exterior of the building to the windows. The thumping started again, this time right against the glass of my living room. Because of the way that the building was situated, he was literally inches away from where I was crouching. I quickly grabbed a kitchen knife and retreated to the bedroom, staring at the window. He was sitting on the grass outside, systematically slamming his heels into the frame, clearly trying to force the pane to shatter. I was alone, and I knew from past experiences that the local patrols, they didn't really prioritize calls in this area. I spent 2 hours gripping that knife, waiting for the glass to give way, but finally, my upstairs neighbor, a woman who had stayed silent the entire time, flung open her door and unleashed a torrent of screaming that sort of seemed to snap the guy out of his trance. He didn't say a word. He just stood up, stumbled toward the stairwell, and vanished into the upper levels. What made my blood run cold, though, wasn't just his erratic behavior. It was what I saw when the sun finally came up that really disturbed me. I went outside to inspect the damage to my window frame, and embedded in the wooden molding, exactly where he had been kicking, was a series of deep, purposeful gouges. He hadn't just been kicking to get in. He had been using a heavy metallic object, clearly a ring or a tool or something, to systematically carve a symbol into the frame over and over again while he was screaming. It was a crude, jagged spiral that looked less like the work of a drunk person and more like a deliberate mark of entry, as if he was trying to, mark the territory or something. I found out later that he was a guest of a tenant on the 3rd floor who had gotten blackout drunk and wandered down to the wrong floor. They called it a mistake, but you don't carve symbols into a frame if you're just trying to get into your friend's apartment. Thankfully, I didn't put the weapon down until the sun was up, and I have confirmed that they are physically off the property for now. But the trauma of that night, it stayed with me for years. And it's a reminder that even when people call it a misunderstanding, your instinct to protect your own life is really the only thing that matters. This happened 2 years ago, back when I was a junior in high school. I woke up with a headache one day and a general sense of malaise. Not truly bedridden sick, but just enough to justify burning a personal day, and I made the decision to play hooky, a choice that I've spent the last 2 years regretting with every fiber of my being. My parents had already left for work, and the silence of the empty house usually felt like a sanctuary. It was about 12:30 p.m. and I was in the living room, nursing a cup of tea when the atmosphere of the house sort of, shifted. There was a knock. It wasn't the tentative tap of a delivery person or anything. It was 3 heavy measured strikes against the old solid oak of the front door. I froze, heart spiking a bit. I crept to the side window, keeping my body pressed against the wall. A man stood on the porch. He looked to be in his early 20s, dressed in a crisp, slightly oversized button-down shirt and dress slacks. He held a clipboard, looking for all the world like a standard door-to-door sales agent, trying to push overpriced window replacements or HVAC inspections. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe, in fact. I just waited for him to lose interest, as they always do, and leave. But he didn't leave. Instead, he stood there for 10 agonizing minutes, his gaze fixed on the front door as if he could see through the wood and pinpoint exactly where I was standing. He didn't check his watch. He didn't look at his phone. He just stood there like a statue, waiting. Finally, he turned and stepped off the porch. I watched him cross the front lawn, and the relief was so physical that it made me a bit dizzy. I walked toward the kitchen to put my tea down, but as I passed the dining room, I stopped. A shadow flickered across the bottom edge of the window. The blinds were pulled shut, but the afternoon sun was bright enough to cast a sharp black silhouette through the slats. It was the man. He hadn't left the property after all. He had simply bypassed the front entrance to get closer to the glass. I watched, paralyzed, as the silhouette moved slowly along the base of the wall, pausing at the frame as if he were trying to press his ear to the siding. I abandoned the dining room instantly and scrambled into the kitchen, crouching behind the island. I could hear the faint crunching of the gravel outside, and through the sliver of the side window next to the back door, I saw him again. He was now walking with purpose toward the rear of the house, his head tilted slightly, scanning the structure. Then the back gate, a heavy wood-slatted thing, began to shake. It wasn't a gust of wind. It was him, violently rattling the whole thing, followed by the sound of the wood straining against the latch. He seemed to be sort of testing the perimeter, checking for weak points, methodically working his way toward the only entry point that he hadn't yet tried. I was huddled in the dark of the pantry, my hand trembling as I dialed my father. The line rang, and in that vacuum of silence, the truth of the situation revealed itself. As the gate continued to strain under his weight, I heard a sound from the other side. It was a person, another person, and they were now talking. There were 2 of them, and this guy was trying to open this gate for another person. Suddenly, the rattling stopped abruptly. I stayed in the pantry for 2 hours as well until I heard my mother's car pull into the driveway. I did some research later. My neighbor, who has a Ring doorbell that covers the approach to my street, eventually showed me the footage, and he had hit their house first, then mine, then the house behind us, and they caught him and this other person on camera, not just ringing doorbells, but cupping his hands against their living room windows and peering inside. The angle didn't cover my backyard, but the timeline was perfect. It wasn't a mistake that he chose the middle of the day. He knew that neighborhood schedule for sure, and he knew when people would be gone, which meant that I wasn't just a random target. I was an audit of the house's security. And to this day, the sound of that gate rattling sends me into a full-blown panic every time I hear it. I have never played hooky since then, and honestly, I never will again. I was 12 years old, living in a quiet, manicured subdivision, primarily occupied by retirees at the time. It was a pretty safe bubble, the kind where you never really check your rearview mirror or behind you while walking through your front door. My routine was pretty clockwork as well. Every morning at 5:30, I'd take our dog for a full perimeter loop of the neighborhood. The sun would be dipping low, casting long orange shadows through the cul-de-sacs, and the air was finally clear of its suburban sort of stickiness. Now, it all started with a white car, tinted windows, opaque and featureless. The first time it crawled past me, and it was slowing to a near halt before accelerating away. I dismissed it as somebody searching for a specific house number, perhaps a visitor lost in the maze of identical driveways, and I mean identical a lot of the time. But it became a bit of a daily thing. The car would pass me, disappear around a bend, and then, miraculously, reappear behind me on the return leg of my walk, idling at the curb. I was in the middle of a sort of short-lived, naive, amateur sleuth phase that I thought that I was being clever with, so I'd whip out my phone, make a show of holding it up to frame the car, or feign a loud FaceTime call to make it clear that I was recording their license plate. I genuinely thought that I was in control of the situation, that my vigilance was acting as a deterrent. I didn't realize that by making myself a performer, I was giving them exactly what they wanted, my undivided attention. One evening, I decided to end the game though. When the car pulled past and turned into my own cul-de-sac, I followed, keeping to the shadows of the manicured hedges. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a mixture of adrenaline and foolish teenage confidence. It parked in front of a blue garage, and I heard the low muffled sound of multiple men arguing inside. A harsh and jagged tension that felt entirely out of the place in our quiet street. I realized then that the car didn't just happen to be there. It was stationed in a non-parking grassy patch, waiting specifically for my return loop, like a bird of prey sitting on a fence. I finally broke down at this point and told my mother. She was absolutely livid, the kind of cold, protective anger that makes your blood run slow, but she started accompanying me on my walks at irregular hours, and I began carrying a canister of pepper spray as well, my thumb permanently hooked into the trigger guard. The car, it stopped appearing though, and honestly I thought that was the end of it. The white vehicle threat, it had been neutralized by the presence of an adult. 2 years later though, my sister and I were walking the dog, caught up in conversation about something that I don't really remember, when we passed the house with the blue garage. A man wearing an oversized, bright floral shirt stepped out onto the porch. He was smiling, a wide, tight, practiced grin that didn't reach his eyes. He waved his hand, hovering in the air for a second too long, and called out in a voice that was way too smooth. "We haven't seen you or your sister out for a walk in a long time. We miss the company." I felt my blood turn to ice. As he stepped forward, the screen door swung wide and I saw into the hallway. Nailed to the wall, right at eye level, was a literal map of our neighborhood, hand-drawn on a sheet of what looked like butcher's paper. It was covered in red marked lines, crisscrossing the streets with obsessive detail. I could see my own house circled in thick, frantic strokes, and there were tiny handwritten notes pinned next to it, which I couldn't really make out from where I was. I realized then that the car, it hadn't been waiting for a random person. It had been waiting for me, and the friendly greeting was just a total cover. I didn't say a word. I pulled my sister's arm, turned and walked away as fast as I could, my skin crawling with the realization that I hadn't been an observer at all. I had been the target of a hunt that just never really stopped. I haven't walked that route since then, and I probably never will again. Six years ago, I was in peak physical condition and rarely went a weekend without taking my toddler out for a long-haul day hike across the Oregon backcountry. It was really our ritual. My gear packed, their small backpack filled with snacks and a spare set of clothes for the inevitable mud crawling, and one Saturday, we tackled a 10-mile loop around a reservoir. It was a crisp, perfect April morning. the kind that starts with a light misty drizzle that makes the forest smell like pine resin and wet earth. My 4-year-old, too, was an absolute dynamo, bounding 20 yards ahead, pausing to expect ferns and collect treasures until their energy finally hit a wall 3 miles in. I hoisted them onto my shoulders, the weight of their small body a familiar anchor, and we kept on pushing. We hit the midpoint, found a flat clearing, and ate our lunch in the sun. But as we started the return leg, the atmosphere just shifted. My child, usually a chatterbox, suddenly went dead silent. They stopped pointing at plants. They didn't want to get down at all. They just gripped my flannel shirt with white-knuckled intensity, and I pushed it off as a nap crash, but then I noticed the forest. The ambience, the trilling frogs, the territorial squawks of jays, the hum of the insects, they had all simply vanished. It was like a vacuum of sound. The silence was so thick, too, that I actually felt it in my eardrums a bit. My skin began to crawl, that primal lizard brain warning that you're no longer the one doing the watching. I carried a hunting axe on my belt at the time, but for the first time in my life, it felt like a toy, really. I gripped a heavy, jagged branch in my free hand, my head now on a swivel. My toddler leaned into my ear and whispered, "We go back. Turn around." They hated backtracking. It just wasn't in their nature at all. And the fact that they were almost begging me made the decision instantaneous. I shifted them from my shoulders to my back, locking them in place with straps of my pack like a makeshift carrier, and started to move. I didn't run, but I certainly walked at a pace that was nearly a jog, my eyes darting into the shadows of the old growth firs. Every snap of a twig at that point sounded like a gunshot. And for that quarter mile, I felt the unmistakable sensation of eyes tracking my movement from the brush, a really heavy predatory focus. Then, just as suddenly as it had died, the forest erupted into life again. The birds started up, the insects resumed their chorus, and the primal tension that had been pinning me to the trail just was gone. Months later, I found a hiker's blog entry describing a series of bizarre incidents in that exact valley too. Other people had reported finding their own discarded gear, things that they'd left on their porches, miles away, neatly arranged on stumps along that specific loop. People were calling it a collector in the woods, but it's weird, right? Also, I realized when I got back to the car that day that when I took my toddler out of the makeshift carrier, I noticed that there were a spare set of clothes, the ones that I had kept tucked in the very bottom of my pack, which I hadn't touched since that morning. They were completely soaked with fresh, warm salt water. Mind you, it wasn't sweat, and it certainly wasn't rain, but it smelled exactly like the reservoir. But that reservoir was stagnant freshwater runoff, and we hadn't gone anywhere near the water. I really don't know how to explain that, at all. I still have that flannel shirt, but I never do wear it now. But if you're hiking deep in the woods and the forest ever goes silent like that, don't just leave. Check your gear as well. I didn't at the time, and I sort of regret not checking because, well, I would like to know if my shirt was actually dry at the time and how on earth it got wet to begin with. I've worked around industrial sites before, but there was one winter job that changed the way that I think about being alone after dark forever. At the time, I was doing overnight maintenance inspections for a company that managed a large stretch of abandoned infrastructure outside of a small town in the Pacific Northwest. Most of the property had been unused for years. There were old pump buildings, storage sheds, drainage channels, rusting machinery, and miles of overgrown access roads. My job wasn't really that exciting too. I would sort of just make rounds, check locks, inspect equipment, and document anything that really needed attention. Because the property was so spread out though, I usually worked alone. This incident, It happened sometime in February. So it had been raining most of that day, and by the time that my shift started, everything was absolutely soaked. A heavy fog had settled over the lower part of the property, making the beam from my flashlight disappear about maybe 20 feet in front of me. I was staying in a small maintenance cabin on the property while the work was being completed. Around 1:30 in the morning, I was lying in bed when I heard something outside. At first, I genuinely thought that it was a part of the building. There was a sort of weird scraping sound to it, but then there was another. It sounded like, I don't know, somebody moving or something being dragged across the concrete outside. I got up and looked out through the window. There was nothing immediately outside of the cabin, but I could see a light moving through the fog further down the access road. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, and that's when I heard a woman shouting. I couldn't make out the words at first. She sounded frightened, though, and was moving quickly through the fog, stumbling every few steps. Then I clearly heard, "Please." I started walking toward her. She appeared about 30 yards away, coming around the corner of an old storage building. She was looking over her shoulder constantly. At first I assumed that somebody must be chasing her. Then I saw a second figure. There was a man following her. He wasn't running, though. He was walking slowly, almost casually, despite the woman clearly trying to get away from him. I shouted that I had called the police, and that got his attention. He stopped. The woman stopped too, and for several seconds, neither of them moved. I raised my flashlight toward the man. He was difficult to make out through the fog, but I could see that he was extremely thin and unusually tall. His clothes looked filthy, almost soaked through with some sort of grease or something, and he just stood there staring at me. I expected him to say something, but he didn't. Instead, the woman suddenly started moving again, but she ran past me without saying a word. I turned toward her for maybe 2 seconds, and when I looked back, the man was gone. But there was really nowhere he could have gone. The road was open in front of me, and the storage building was surrounded by a chain-link fence. I swept my flashlight across the area several times, but there was nothing. I decided that I wasn't going to follow him, so I returned to the cabin and I locked the door. The woman was now gone, too. I made a report of it, and after that, I barely slept. The next morning, I spoke to the supervisor about the incident, and he assumed that I'd encountered somebody trespassing on the property, and told me that there had been problems with people camping in some of the unused buildings or something. The explanation honestly made a lot of sense to me, at least initially. Later that afternoon, I was checking one of the drainage structures on the opposite side of the property when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the mud, 2 sets. One appeared to belong to a normal pair of boots, but the other, well, that was a completely different story. The impressions were extremely narrow and unusually long. They looked almost like somebody walking on the very tips of their feet, but extremely long. I followed them for maybe 20 yards before they disappeared completely, just in the middle of nowhere. I figured that the rain must have washed the rest away, and I didn't think much more about it. That night, though, I was making my final round shortly after midnight when I heard somebody walking behind me. I stopped, and the footsteps stopped. I turned around, but there was nothing there. I continued walking, and a few seconds later I heard them again. This time, too, they were way closer. I spun around and pointed my flashlight behind me, but there was no one there. Then I heard this breathing sound, not behind me, but literally right beside me. I immediately stepped backward, my skin crawling, but there was nobody there. But I could clearly hear somebody breathing, almost labored. I backed away toward my vehicle without taking my eyes off of the darkness. That's when someone struck the side of the building behind me. There was this huge bang, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Then another one, and whatever was making the noise was hitting the metal wall from inside, I think. I reached the vehicle, though, unlocked it, and I got inside. Before I could start the engine, I heard something scrape across the roof. I froze. Another scrape followed, and then silence. I started the truck, and I drove straight back to the cabin. The following morning, I told my supervisor that I wanted to leave that property, and he agreed to come out and inspect the area with me. We walked around the building where I heard the impacts, and there were no signs of anyone having entered. But there was something else. Several long scratches had been, gouged, literally, into the metal siding. They started roughly 7 feet above the ground, I would say, and my supervisor stared at them for a while. Then he asked me how tall the person that I'd seen the night before had been, and I told him. He didn't say anything after that. That afternoon, we checked the unused buildings more carefully, and inside one of them we found evidence that someone had been living there. There was a makeshift sleeping area and a few things scattered around, so there really had been someone on that property, but that doesn't really explain everything, right? I mean, that should have made me feel better, but it just didn't. Because beside the sleeping area were dozens of small objects arranged in a weird circle with animal bones. Not large ones, but like birds and rodents and things like that. And in the center was a piece of my work clothing, a reflective strip from one of my old jackets, and I could tell that it was mine because my jacket was different from everybody else's. I had lost that jacket several weeks earlier, too. I actually asked my supervisor at the time if he had moved it, and he hadn't. Neither had anyone else, and so after seeing that, we left the building, and that night I slept in my truck with the doors locked instead of sleeping in the cabin. Around 3 a.m, I woke up because something was standing outside. I could see its silhouette through the windshield. I honestly don't remember what woke me up, but it was facing away from me, and at first I thought that it was the same man that I had seen earlier, but then it slowly turned its head, and not its body, but just its head. It looked toward the truck, and I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could tell that it was looking directly at me, and it looked strange. I reached for my keys, the figure suddenly stepping into the darkness. I started the engine, and as I pulled away, something struck the rear of the truck hard enough to make the whole vehicle literally shake. Well, I didn't stop. I drove to some other buildings with some other people, and I just stayed with them for the rest of the night. And a few days later, my supervisor called me, and he told me that they'd found another abandoned shelter farther into the property, and apparently, inside there were photographs. They were mostly old pictures of people who had worked around the site years earlier, but one of them was a photograph of the maintenance crew from decades ago. I eventually saw the photograph myself, and yeah, it was old, and apparently that was the old crew. And while that doesn't really explain much, I thought that I should add it because it's weird, right? Look, I don't know what happened to that woman that I saw that first night. I don't know who that man was, and I certainly don't know what was making those noises around the buildings. Maybe there's a group of homeless people living on the property somewhere, or maybe someone was deliberately trying to scare me away. But I still cannot explain at least one thing. You see, the morning after I left, my supervisor checked the security cameras around the maintenance cabin, and he told me that there was no footage of anyone approaching my truck that night. But there was, however, a section of footage from 3:02 in the morning where the camera briefly picked up something moving through the darkness. It passed directly behind my vehicle, and he said that it was too far away to identify, but whatever it was, it had stopped for several seconds, and it appeared to be looking directly at the camera almost. And then, apparently, it just walked away into the trees. I never asked him to send me the footage or anything because Well, part of me just doesn't want to know about any of that and see it because, well, I have to continue working here and I just don't have any other options right now. So, some important context first. Paul was a longtime friend of one of my parents. It seemed like around the time that this all started, he stopped taking his medication. I actually had no idea about his disorder prior to the beginning of this whole situation too. This has been ongoing for almost 2 years now. I also live with my parents and sibling. So early 2023, Paul shows up at our house and appears to be on drugs. Police are called and after a while he's driven home. His friend, my dad Ron, goes to Paul's house to check on him, finds his meds, notices that he's not himself, witnesses him hitting his cat, is also not feeding it properly. And here's where things get a little bit tricky. I'll admit that this is where we went wrong. Okay, so imagine your best friend of many years has a debilitating mental illness, stops taking their meds, beats their pet, and you think, hey, until they get back on their meds, I'm going to take their pet because I love my friend and I don't want them to hurt the animal that they obviously love when on their meds. This was a bad idea because even in that circumstance, you are not allowed to just take somebody else's pet. We love this cat and we tried to make the best decision for him and his cat at the time. Following this though, hundreds of texts sent to both parents, very angry and scary ramblings. Eventually, I get some texts as well. Lots of Facebook posts calling us the villains. We try to look into getting him admitted into a psych ward. It doesn't work out because he's an adult and they can't force him to stay. Sends a friend to try and break into our house in broad daylight, right after we changed the locks because he threatened this prior. By now, we have a caseworker who we've explained the situation to. He understands but says that it's not worth the struggle and suggests a mediated returning of Paul's pet. We do this despite being worried for the cat's well-being. Ironically too, he texts me after the fact saying that we were right to take his cat. I wish I still had this message, but I think I blocked him over text at some point and cannot find it now. You think it's over? Well, think again. Side note too, the amount of text that we were getting during this time was actually insane. They were all very angry, implied and even outright stated some very scary stuff. Additionally, many of the texts that we would get or posts made to scare and defame us were very jumbled and not well written, which seems to be par for the course for someone with schizophrenia, according to our caseworker at least. The new problem though? Well, when you're friends with someone for over 20 years, you gift them things, they gift you things. That is also true about Paul and Ron's friendship. Exactly a year after this happened, I get a text with some very colourful language asking for his stuff back. I don't respond because that's what I've been instructed to do. This past week, we have had 2 letters drilled, not taped or pasted, onto our back door within the span of a few weeks. This is the first time between contact since the very start of this ordeal, and the letters were threatening, scrawled in big harsh lettering, and this is what pushed me to share this here. So when this initially became a problem, the police told us all to cut contact and to never interact with him for any reason, even to give borrowed and gifted stuff back. I'm starting to think that that was a bad idea though. Do we just give the stuff that we know that we were lent back? The main item being asked for is something that we don't even have anymore. I don't believe that somebody in this state of mind can be reasoned with, but I don't know, maybe they can? For the past year I've had this constant lingering anxiety and honestly I'm just sort of sick of it. I'm sharing this here because I just cannot think of any good outcome from anything that we try to do to resolve this situation. He knows where we live. He has means to support himself without working, seems to act normal when the situation calls for it. Maybe people with schizophrenia or people who know others with the disorder can chime in here because, honestly, I'm just scared. We do have means of defending ourselves if need be. We're getting a porch camera, but I kind of just feel like I'm waiting around for the situation to escalate at this stage. I'm scared of the unpredictability of someone with that disorder. We've contacted the police, but they basically can't do anything. We just don't meet the criteria to file for a report online. This happened sometime in 2013 when I was 19. I had my room in the basement in my dad's house. It was late at night and I laid there on my bed in complete darkness like I always did. I needed to sleep because I had school the next day, but I suffered from insomnia back then and felt too energetic to fall asleep. I laid there for a good while with thoughts swirling around in my mind like I always did when I suddenly heard some kind of noise. I opened my eyes, but as I mentioned before, it was completely dark. I started to think that I had imagined it, but then I heard it again, a scratching sound. From there it went on, getting more and more intense, and I quickly realized the noise was coming from underneath my bed. My eyes widened and panic spread throughout my body. It sounded as if someone was frantically clawing on the floor. Did I leave one of the cats in here before I went to bed, I thought, trying everything to rationalize the situation. But I already knew not even a cat could make that kind of a noise. Then, that's when I felt something, like a scratching and a punching against my back from underneath my mattress. The best way that I can describe the whole thing is to imagine some poor soul being trapped inside of a coffin, desperately trying to break out, and I was on top of that coffin. Well, I was paralyzed by the shock of it all, not knowing what to do. After I had been laying there for a good while with the scratching and the punching still going on, my fear eventually turned into some kind of rage. I jumped out of bed, ran across the room and turned on the lights. Then I threw myself on the floor, looked under the bed and yelled, "What do you want from me?" But when I did, nothing was there. The scratching, it had stopped and there was nobody else in the room except for me. Somehow I managed to fall asleep eventually after that experience, and a couple of months later, a friend of mine from school moved into our house. She rented a room from my dad on the top floor. After she had been there for about 3 nights, she came to me in the morning and said that she had the craziest thing happen to her during the night. I could almost feel my skin turn pale as she told me the story of the exact same thing that had happened to me. The scratching, the punching against the mattress. I knew for certain that I had never told her about my experience, and we were both really freaked out when I told her the exact same thing had happened to me 2 floors down, months earlier. When I was 11, I was walking the 4 blocks to the JCC by my house and meeting my 2 best friends who were sisters, D and B. I was walking and feeling relaxed because I'd walked to the J a million times before. I started walking past a small empty office building, and that's when I noticed a dark car idling way in the back. The car had tinted windows, and the driver rolled down his window and said that I was very beautiful and asked if I modeled. He had sunglasses and a baseball cap on. He also had a salt and pepper sort of red beard. He looked like he was in his 30s or maybe 40s. I said yes, and he asked if he could take my pictures. I stupidly told him my plans to meet B and D. He said that he could tell that I'd modeled, and I was getting more creeped out by his behavior. He continued to talk to me, and then even took a couple of photos of me. As he continued to talk to me, I suddenly got a bit of a bad feeling. My heart suddenly dropped into my stomach. I remembered what my parents said about not talking to any strangers, and all my alarms were suddenly going off. He slightly moved his car, and that terrified me. He asked me to come over so that he could get better pictures. I was now hyper aware of everything that was going on. I told him that I had to meet my mum, which was different from what I told him earlier, but I didn't even think of that because I was so terrified. He kept trying to get me to go closer to his car, and I saw a mum watering her lawn and said that she was my mum, and I broke off in a sprint all the way home. I I was shaking and crying by the time that I got home, and I told my mum and she took me to the police station. To my shock, D&B were actually there too, because he'd gone to the JCC where I said that I was meeting them. He took their pictures, which they thought was actually funny at the time, but we did a police sketch and found out that there was another girl that he had taken pictures of, and, terrifyingly, had tried to take her too. They unfortunately never did catch the guy, and that scares me a lot, thinking about the fact that this guy is out there on the loose. I'll preface this with saying that I've never had a paranormal experience until this night. This happened around 4 years ago, and I was 25, a male, and ever since this experience, I've had an altered perception of the afterlife, multiple dimensions, and what our reality may be. So I was up late one night laying in bed, close to 2 in the morning. I'm laying down and my cat at the time was laying in between my legs, fast asleep. I'm scrolling on my phone when all of a sudden my cat awakes and is staring at the stairwell that is the entrance to my basement bedroom. My cat starts to growl deeply and puffs up a bit, in classic cat fashion. He then starts to back up towards me as he is still facing and growling in the direction of the stairs. Meanwhile, I'm thoroughly creeped the heck out and frozen in fear. I'm sitting up in bed at this point, and my cat is now backed up fully into my stomach, while growling, mind you. He hisses for the first time, and as he did, I had this sensation of an ice-cold chill move directly over my body and through me, as if it was a blanket of cold air that had enveloped me. Chills went throughout my whole body, and this feeling was utterly, for a lack of a better word, disgusting. Out loud, I murmured, "Oh no," and then I proceeded to grab my cat and carry him upstairs to another bedroom to finally sleep. Now this is where it gets even stranger. You see, I spoke with my mum the following day after she was home from work. I told her the entire story and that I was thoroughly creeped out. And unbeknownst to me, my mother had been at a funeral the previous day, and she mentioned that when she was driving home from the cemetery, that it felt like someone was in the car with her. Originally, she thought that it may have been a family member coming to visit from the other side, but couldn't quite pin it down. But after hearing what I said, we saged the house and said some blessings. Still to this day, I've never experienced anything like that, nor do I want to. What creeped me out the most was that it was directed straight at me, as if it was wandering around and waiting until it was attracted and searched for an ideal life force. That was the only time that I've experienced anything paranormal, and I still cannot rationalize the experience to say that it was my mind playing tricks on me, or my cat just acting weird. I mean, I felt that cold air, and it was unnatural. My cat behaving the way that it was, that was unnormal too. So, say your prayers and eat your vegetables. So I'm just going to be blunt. I went to the hospital for just under a month, and while I was there, my nurses joked that I was on the haunted floor. They repeatedly got alarms and saw movement in my room while I was sleeping, allegedly. It got to the point that they had to turn off some of the alarms as they kept waking me up. Things started almost immediately, though, when I got home. I was getting out of the car, and my mother and I clearly heard someone shout my name when I stumbled. Then, when I was helped into bed, there were these sounds that we couldn't figure out where they were coming from. We checked everywhere too until, well, we just kind of gave up in the end. Then, that night, my blanket and shirt were pulled so hard that I actually turned on my side, and I had a seizure just a few moments later. And finally, yesterday, I got out of bed alone only to collapse. My head felt fuzzy, and I was incredibly exhausted and out of breath. There was no way, absolutely no way that I would be able to call for help, and it just happened so quickly. But then, my family literally came running into my room. They didn't hear me fall, but they were adamant that they heard someone scream their names from that part of the house. They first thought that it was one of them, but then quickly realized that it wasn't, asked me if I yelled, and I knew that it wasn't me. Mum said that someone had screamed her name though, and Dad and my sister, all their names back to back like they were being gutted. She was adamant that it sounded like someone was being murdered. So, it's not bad, but I'm just so lost. I'm a realist. I like science and explaining things away as best as I can. So, what the heck is going on? Can anyone please help, or at least give me some advice as to what to expect from this, because I just feel like I'm going crazy. So I've lived in this house for about 8 years now. My family bought it, and we're in a small city in Ontario, Canada. The house is just a typical house, I suppose, built in the 70s. The first day we moved in, I remember feeling a strange vibe in the house. Didn't really put much thought into it though, and when we toured the house before buying it, I never got any strange vibes at all, so I just chalked that up to me just feeling weird. Anyway, a few months in, we started experiencing strange, unexplainable things. Papers moving into other spots in the house when nobody is home. My grandmother died. Her death certificate moved to a completely different table one day while we were out. It's only 2 of us that live here, and it wasn't either of us that moved it. We'd both frequently seen shadows moving in the corners of our eyes too. If we were cooking in the kitchen, it would feel as if you were being watched, certainly enough to make you turn around and look as well. There were footsteps and just the usual haunted house things, I guess. Well, about 2 years in, my father got up in the night and went downstairs. His room is right across from mine, and I can see straight into the doorway from my bed. And I saw a white clouded figure walk into his room, and suddenly the door slammed shut, and that scared the heck out of me. I yelled at him for slamming the door, and a minute later, my dad walked up the stairs and asked me why I shut his door and why I was yelling at him. I explained to him that I just watched someone walk into his room and slam the door, but it wasn't me. I genuinely thought that it was him that walked into the room. Not to mention that my dad's door is on a weird angle, and it's not possible for the door to be blown shut like that. The door won't even stay halfway open without putting something in front of it. It just falls open and sits against the wall. You have to physically close the door for it to close. Skip forward a little bit, 4 years in, and I was sleeping one night and randomly woke up. I looked at the foot of the bed and saw a crystal clear image of a face staring at me. He was an old man and he was very blue-colored. I freaked out and went under the covers to try to fall back to sleep. About 6 years in, we find out from our neighbor that one of the past owners actually passed away in the house from a heart attack. He was an older man, so this is who I think we must have seen. We also randomly found out somehow that one of my cousins was friends with the last owner's children and spent a lot of time in this house. Before I even mentioned anything to her about the experiences that we'd had in the house, she asked if we knew that it was haunted. I didn't get any stories from her about what the old owners experienced in the house, but they also knew that it was haunted allegedly. So it wasn't just us. We've also seen some things that aren't explainable by the old man passing away in the house too. What I mean is that we've seen shadow figures and non-human figures. We kind of describe them as alien-like, in fact. Besides the creepy haunted vibes that we get and the strange shadow figures that we've seen, the old man ghost doesn't present to me as being harmful. He's just sort of there, I guess. He seems to be checking in on things, I suppose. He just sort of wanders around. There's a few rooms in particular, though, that always have a strange energy. One is the basement, and the other is the sitting room that we have. The basement is just one large room. It's not a typical creepy basement by any means. It's definitely finished, but my cat is also extremely attracted to the basement for some reason. It's strange too, because it's empty and there's really nothing down there that should draw her to it. There's been times where we've seen her batting at the air as if someone is playing with her too, but nothing is there. We've tried renting out the basement to tenants and it never works out. All of them leave after a few months. My sister once lived down there for a few months and had some very, very bizarre experiences that I won't share for now, but it's quite lengthy, and feel free to let me know if you would like me to share those stories at some point. And anyone that goes down there, they always admit that there's a strange vibe to it. I want to make this basement into my bedroom, but to be quite honest, I'm sort of terrified to do so. All of the strange shadow figures and non-human entities that we've seen have always been in that basement. Usually while we're doing laundry down there we've seen them, or the past tenants have seen them down there too. But I just wonder what exactly that is. I'm comfortable having the old man ghost with us, but it's these non-human things that really just terrify me. I'm a very logical scientist type, but I was raised as a Christian. Not super strict or anything, and we didn't go to church regularly. But it was ingrained that demons exist, so don't mess with them, don't play with Ouija, etc. Why take the risk? I had experiences in the house that I grew up in, footsteps and then laughter when I reacted. These were few and far between. Mostly a general dark and uneasy feeling and feelings of being watched. Now when I'm there alone after not living there for years, watching dogs, I feel like a presence wants to keep me there, and it's much worse than when I lived there. It feels like since it knows that I'm not there often, it wants to make the most of its old prey being there, I suppose. I have a history of PTSD, unrelated to the house, so I imagine that makes me the easiest target for a malicious entity. But I've been highly functional for about 5 years now, so it's not so bad. Now, yesterday, after being in the house alone for about an hour, after having a great day and a great week, I had a full-on mental breakdown. After calling someone and saying that I was scared of the presence, a noise led me to the living room, where the angel of a dog who was resting peacefully a minute earlier began doing a horrible growling and snarling sound, first into space and then towards me, that she has never done before. I grabbed my stuff and I split quickly, and when I got back to my place, I saged myself and the house too. Today I went back wearing a cross, a malachite beaded bracelet, protects from or absorbs negative energies apparently, and brought my sage. I had my sister pray with me outside, then I went in and blessed the whole house. I felt pretty good about that, but more of a guess we'll have to wait and see if that even helps sort of thing. At home I'm relaxing and had the malachite bracelet taken off, sitting next to me on the armchair of the couch. It was just sitting there, not being touched or anything, and the elastic suddenly snaps out of nowhere, and the beads literally fall everywhere. Obviously, it could be nothing. Like I said, I try to be as logical as I can, but with certain things, I try not to play. My one thought was, well, what if it did absorb some sort of malevolent energy, and its snapping released it here in my actual home? I don't feel the dark energy here, so I don't think it is, but again, I try not to play. An old Wiccan friend gave me a go-away evil spray sort of thing, so I sprayed them, am going to do sage over them, try to scoop them with something and soak in Florida water, I guess. I'm not touching them is what I'm getting at. That's a no for me. The thing is though is that I have to go back and am responsible for the dogs the next 2 days. I love these dogs. They've been really stressed too, not knowing where their owners are, so I'm definitely going to walk them and spend some time with them too. But I'll be honest and say that I'm concerned that with it being so close to Halloween, with the veil being its thinnest allegedly, each day, well, it could get worse. Does anyone have any advice for protecting myself while still being in that house for, well, short periods this weekend? I try to avoid going at night, but I need to for at least one of their meds. So if you have any advice, then thank you in advance. A few weekends ago, my friends and I set out for a camping trip in Lake Cagonza State Park, located in Staunton, WA. While finishing up some geocaching on a hiking trail near the outhouses, we encountered something, or I guess someone, strange. So, you can enter the trail after crossing the path of another trail that enters the forest. The trail that we were on circled a prairie that laid in the middle of the trail and was surrounded by forest. The sun was low in the sky. It had to have been roughly 6 p.m. The sun was just above the tree line as we started our hike. As we were at our last geocache of the night, the sun had just gone behind the tree line, and it was beginning to get dark, but we could still see without the assistance of flashlights. The forest, it went silent. No more sounds of bugs around us or birds that have been active all day. And, whatever it was, it approached us with a whistle, a bone-chilling whistle. Our entire group went silent and nobody said a word, until we heard a second whistle. This second whistle was more broken up than the first, I guess, and in the slightly tipsy state that I was in, I thought that it had been a human whistle as it was not perfect. To that I responded with a pretty stern, "Hello," hoping for an explanation as to why our group got whistled at twice. "I thought you were dogs," a voice said as it rounded the trail towards us. As he passed our group, I noticed that I could not make out a face out on his person, but chalked it up to nerves and being distracted. As a group, we agreed that while it was a strange encounter, we shouldn't really panic, but took it as a sign to get off the trail at this stage. But this is where things get even more weird. You see, all 4 of us in the group kept our eyes peeled for anything as we made our way back to the car, when suddenly this creature, calling it a creature as it surely wasn't human, suddenly appeared on the edge of the trail closest to the woods. Staring blankly to the field in front of it, that would have been to our right, and in the flattest, driest tone it said, "Who's that guy?" Everyone in our group kept walking as I answered, "The same guy from earlier," as I assumed it was talking about my boyfriend who was behind the group. We had never been so silent on the walk back to the car though. Checking behind our shoulders and our surroundings constantly, we made it back to our campsite where we decided, due to the time of the day, that it would be best to wait to pack up until morning. While we were debriefing our experience, I told my friends how, in neither encounter, I just couldn't make out any faces. Being a female hiker, I make a point to gather some facial features of anyone that I cross on the trail, just as a bit of a just in case. But no one in our group could identify a face, and in our own ways we described how the face on this thing was not a human face. It seemed to almost have a blurred effect over what should have been a human face. All of us had seen the same thing, like you could tell where the eyes, nose and mouth should have been, but there was just none on this person or creature or whatever. Being that it whistled and was not identifiable, we are convinced that we may have encountered a skinwalker, but the weird thing is that they are just not that relevant in that area of Wisconsin. It was a long night at the campsite with the impending feeling of being watched. I'm spiritually inclined and I took the necessary steps of protecting our campsite for a secure night's sleep. But I have had a strange encounter since then. I'm willing to explain those encounters at some point, but for now, I'd really like to get your thoughts on this. What did we see, and are skinwalkers known for having blurred faces like this? If you can help me out, then I would appreciate it. This is the second and the last of what I consider to be a paranormal encounter that I have experienced. This happened about 6 years ago, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. So I was sleeping soundly when suddenly I felt a cold breath in my ear. It jolted me awake, but I didn't open my eyes out of fear of what I might have seen. I lay there motionless, pretending to be asleep. I could hear and feel every inhale and exhale. The breath was unnaturally cold, like the blast of air when you open a freezer, and it was right there brushing against my ear. For what felt like a few minutes, the icy breath lingered. Then it stopped. I felt a weight settle on my side, pressing down as if something was sitting on me. It was a little difficult to breathe with the pressure on me, but I was way too terrified to move. I stayed frozen, praying that whatever it was would just leave me alone. After about 15 minutes, the weight lifted off of me and I heard the breathing again, but it was above me now, on the ceiling. It hung there heavy and slow, moving to the center of the room. Then it drifted to the corner above the door. Still too afraid to open my eyes, I tried to wait it out. It had to end sometime, right? In my mind, I was trying to think of a logical explanation for what could be happening, but none of it made any sense. I'm a skeptic of the paranormal, but whatever this was, it definitely did not feel human. I lay there paralyzed, listening to the breathing for what felt like forever. But roughly half an hour went by, and all I could do was focus on this heavy breathing coming from that corner of my room. I couldn't take it anymore, though. I had to do something, because just lying there hoping that it would end felt more terrifying than confronting it. If I stayed still, it might never leave, and that thought was worse than the fear itself. I remembered the flashlight on my nightstand. I had to grab it. I had to shine the light on the corner, expose whatever was there. So I rehearsed the plan over and over in my head. How far was the flashlight? How would I grab it? How fast could I turn it on? I went through every detail like it was life or death, because it felt like it was. If I messed up or if I fumbled, I genuinely thought that I could die. It sounds illogical, I know, but this whole situation was illogical, and when you go through something like this, it's hard to think clearly. Finally, though, I decided that it was time. So in one swift motion, I grabbed the flashlight off the nightstand, turned it on, and as I lifted it up, this must have taken less than half a second. If this was an Olympic sport, I would have won gold in that moment. That's how quickly I got to it. But as I shined the light into the corner of the room, I saw, nothing. There was nothing there, and the breathing had seemingly stopped. I sat there, trying to compose myself, trying to calm my racing heart as I shined the light around the room, searching for whatever had been tormenting me for the last hour at this stage. But there was no one, there was nothing, and I was alone. I got up and turned on the light, and then I sat there waiting for daylight to come, too scared to sleep now, in case it came back. I don't have a logical explanation for what happened that night. How could I? How could I explain a chilling breath directly in my ear that I not only heard but felt? Crazy dream? No, this woke me up. I was having a wonderful sleep before this. So, how do I explain the weight of something sitting on top of me? I don't own any pets. I'm someone who likes to analyze things and think them through logically, but this is one thing that just doesn't have a logical explanation. I have since moved from that house, and thankfully I haven't experienced anything like that since then. I, a 20-year-old female, have been with my boyfriend, 22 and male, for over 5 years now. Throughout our relationship, he told me that he keeps experiencing sleep paralysis, and that it became more and more frequent. He had maybe 1 or 2 the first 3 years, but last year they just kept getting worse. We are both students, and for the past 3 years he's been living in a rented apartment with a good friend of ours. Sometimes I spend the night there as well. And one time, last year, he told me that he experienced sleep paralysis again, and his experience went like this. He was aware and awake, but wasn't able to move or say anything, like his lips were glued together almost. He said that he tried to scream my name to wake me up so that I could help him, but just nothing ever came out of his mouth. He also mentioned that he kept seeing in front of one of the corners of the room a big black shadow that made him feel really nauseous. Thankfully, he eventually got out of it and he went back to bed. Now, the next day I was still there, and he asked me to stay with him that night as well, in case something happened again, because he's starting to get a bit scared of it. I tried to stay awake in case something did happen, but I think I immediately fell asleep, to be honest. And this is how I was woken up in the middle of the night. So I heard some sounds and immediately opened my eyes, and there was my boyfriend laying on his side with his back to me, resting his head on one hand, and saying random stuff in a language that I have never ever heard before, looking at the exact same corner that he mentioned about when he had the sleep paralysis. The weirdest thing, though, is that it seemed like he was having an actual conversation. He would talk and then stop as if somebody was answering, and then he would talk again, and so on and so forth. I was like, what the heck is he doing, and called his name. He immediately stopped talking, and then the heaviest silence filled the room for what seemed like forever. Then he started hysterically laughing, the scariest laugh that I'd ever heard. Quite honestly, it didn't even seem to be his laugh. Next thing I know, he literally falls back asleep and starts snoring. I froze, not knowing what to do and also not wanting to wake him up again. I just stayed there waiting for the dawn while tearing up a bit. The next day, I told him about what had happened, and he didn't remember any of it. He felt really sorry for what he put me through, although it wasn't his fault, obviously. We told his friend what had happened as well, and that made him share this experience from the same night. So, apparently, he had the worst nightmare where he felt like he was literally glued to the bed, forced to stare in the eyes of a dark figure in the corner of his room. He said that he literally tried to scream for help and asked if we heard anything. I certainly didn't. But then he woke up and the time was around 3 a.m. I then asked if he heard my boyfriend hysterically laughing, and he said no. But I wouldn't be surprised if these things happened at the same time. To this day, this is my most frightening story that I've ever had, and they're still living there, so yeah, that's fun, I suppose. So firstly, I'll preface this with saying that I'm an open-minded person, but I don't instantly jump to the thinking that something is supernatural. I like to find a logical reason for something happening, and if anyone can bring any logic to this situation, then I will gladly take it. It's difficult to know where to start, so if I jump back and forward here a little bit, then I apologize. My home, it was inherited by my partner's parents after their death. His dad died 15 years ago, his mum 6 years ago. We lived in the house with his mum for a year before her passing, and in that time I was her full-time carer, and we became very close friends. When she passed away, we were distraught but knew that it was coming. She had stage 4 lymphoma and passed in the hospital. She was Irish Catholic, and after she passed, she was cremated and her ashes never came back to the house. I don't know if that's important, but I thought that I should mention it just in case. Now, my partner's dad didn't pass at home either, but his passing was much more sudden. He suffered a heart attack at work and died before the ambulance could get to him, unfortunately. Again, he was cremated, but his ashes did come home into the house, and both have since been buried in a family plot in Ireland. After he passed, I do believe that I saw his spirit in a mirror. When I entered the home one day, I saw him look in the mirror in the living room to check who was passing in the hall, like he has done many times before, when he was alive, that is. It wasn't long too after his passing, and I cannot be 100% about what I saw due to the grief, but this is not what I'm actually here to share today. The issue that I'm currently experiencing is a little more mischievous, I suppose. If I really think about it, this has been happening since we moved in, I suppose, but has really picked up momentum in the last few months. It started very simply. Something would go missing in the house, something that wouldn't normally go missing, such as an ornament in the living room, something that you would really have no reason to move. You would notice it was missing and look for it, Get to the point of almost giving up, and then bam, it's right there, almost right in front of you, and always somewhere that you have definitely checked before. But more recently though, things that I need are going missing too. My keys, my debit card even, TV remotes, etc. The same pattern happens though. It's always you look for missing item, and just when you're about to throw in the towel, no matter where you've been already looking, it will appear in an incredibly obvious place where you have definitely looked. Now, I know what you're all thinking. You're just misplacing items, not looking hard enough, and then finding them later. That may be true, but it has happened to both my partner and myself, and us both collectively even. But it's the thing that happened yesterday, however, that is what is making me wonder what the heck is actually going on. So my partner is a bit of an idiot sometimes. He doesn't see an accident that's about to happen until it's too late. So he had his AirPods in his pocket. He pulled down his pants to use the toilet, did his business and pulled his pants back up. And when he did that, his AirPods fell out of his pocket, straight into the loo that he had just pressed the flush for. He saw the AirPods disappear into the water, and so they were no more. He told me immediately about this. He was obviously disappointed because they're definitely not cheap, but he was more mad at himself for just being an idiot. We put the incident behind us and we moved on with our day though. Now, at the end of the night, we did the close down for our house, turned things off, got the dogs to go to bed, and we're about to turn in ourselves when he lets out a little bit of a scream. I run to him and the AirPods are sat on the top of the fireplace. They were definitely the same ones, as they have a little marking on the inside and have a teal silicone cover as well. The logical response is that my partner is playing tricks on me, but this has happened when he has not been in the house and could not have had anything to do with it. I also don't know if there's a possibility I'm just losing my mind or something. I keep remembering the stories my mother-in-law told me from her childhood. She grew up in Ireland in a rural location, and oh boy, she has some tales. Ghost stories, banshee screams. Her sister swears she saw a leprechaun one night, but it's a different story. I would be here all day recounting all of them, but she used to tell me about when she was a child and things would go missing in the house. She used to shout, "Okay, it's time to give it back now," or something to that effect. And within minutes, the missing thing would be back in place. Is this the same thing now? Was something attached to my mother-in-law and now she is no longer here, it's with us? There is also sometimes a feeling in the house, I guess you could say. It feels heavy. I've felt physical pressure on my shoulders, in fact. This usually comes when I feel down or scared or any other big emotion. The heavy feeling isn't unpleasant, but it's not comforting either. It's not bad or good, it's just sort of there, I guess. I'll also add that we do have carbon monoxide detectors and they're checked frequently along with smoke and heat detectors, so they're all working. And so my question for all of you guys is, well, what's happening? Am I just going mad? Is something paranormal happening in my home? Any input would genuinely be very much appreciated. I've been on the fence for a very long time about whether to share this part of my story or not when I was a kid. Perhaps it's because now I hope to find some answers to what I had encountered, but whatever the case, here's what happened. So I used to live in the suburbs of Georgia in a pretty quiet neighborhood. I spent 16 years of my life at that house and experienced a lot of unusual activity. Actually, my entire family has. Guests and close friends of mine who have spent some time at my house have always left feeling unsettled. For the rough 16 years my family and I were living in that house, we never spoke a word on the unsettling events that we experienced until we moved out. It was 16 years later when we broke the silence to each other and made my childhood experience less of a what if and into a scary reality. So my mum told me that when she first bought the house, she had invited a lot of her church friends to come in and bless the home. One of the church members, upon entering the home, felt inclined to go upstairs into the master bedroom. Mind you, this is her first time visiting. My mum was confused, but allowed her to do so. When the friend walked into the master bedroom on the second floor, she apparently looked like she was seeing something that she shouldn't have, and abruptly sort of pulled my mum aside and told her to pray because the room was flooded with unwanted spirits. Then the blessing of the home proceeded more intensely within the group. Interestingly, my grandmother, who was visiting for the first time, had made a comment about this room as well, saying how it doesn't have a good atmosphere. She wasn't religious at all, by the way. My sister and I slept in that room every night as children, since we preferred sleeping with our grandparents rather than ourselves in our dedicated rooms. I remember having sleep paralysis every single day, and waking up at odd hours of the night staring into the dark cracks of the bathroom doors. I would always get chills, and then I would fall back to sleep. This was a daily occurrence, and when my sister and I got kicked out to the official move into your own shared room when I was 9, it was the same thing always. Sleep paralysis, wake up several times in the middle of the night, stare into the cracks of the doors, chills, and sleep. One night, though, stood out amongst many of the others that I could never forget. My bed at the time was situated where I was against the wall, and the foot of the bed meets the entrance of the door. Super bad feng shui, but I had woken up in the middle of the night again. I think my mum forgot to close the door behind her after tucking us into bed, so the door was wide open, and my eyes were, for some reason, sort of hyperfixated straight into the master bedroom door, which I could see straight ahead on the right side. It was like I was expecting something to happen, and I see the black slit of a crack growing wider. The door was literally opening, and I saw a white figure come out of the room. I saw her so clearly that I had never forgotten her sight. She was an old lady wearing a white Victorian dress, tight bun sitting at the nape of her neck, hands poised in front of her. She never turned in my direction, thank goodness, and literally made her way across my room and onto the staircase on my left, which was out of vision for me. I remember being frozen in unexplainable fear. I never shared this with anybody at the time, but I certainly never forgot it. And that was probably the major story of everything that happened there, but a frequent visitor that I'd see lurking in the dark was a young girl, also wearing a white dress. She would come into my dreams, stare at me from a corner and do her ghostly stuff. My sister and I realized that we had had the exact same dream of her as well at some point. As I got older, I got more numb to those activities, I suppose. Daily sleep paralysis was still a thing, and I started to get annoyed at them more than being scared. I learned later that a friend had a dream of that girl standing at the end of a master bedroom closet staring at him. It was when he moved into my neighborhood after his dream that he realized that the bedroom that he had seen was the one that I was in. A friend of mine later told me that when she slept over at my house, she had woken up to the girl staring at her, and she was able to describe the girl a little bit clearer than I could. A dirty white dress, long brown or black hair. She was young, maybe around 12 to 14. The list continues and more abnormal stuff occurred. My dog barking into the darkness in the middle of the night, hearing my name when nobody called me, footsteps when nobody was there. The sleep paralysis and all the paranormal stuff stopped when I moved out though, thankfully. And I always wondered if it had to do with the land that the home was situated on. I tried to see if my county had any records of what the land used to be used for before the house was built on it, but unfortunately, it was all to no avail. My name is Jules, and this story happened in 2022. At the time, I was a business school student, but my English skills left much to be desired. So to improve, I decided to take a gap year and move to Toronto, Canada, for intensive language courses. Since the costs were high, I found a shared apartment with some other students. It had 3 bedrooms and one was still empty, waiting for another student to move in. My roommate, Sandra, was a Swiss German, tall, almost 2 meters in fact, and 120 kilos, but also very friendly, and we quickly became friends. A few weeks later, Sandro told me that he was going on a week-long road trip through Canada's national parks. He was set to leave on a Saturday morning, while I had been informed that the new student would arrive that same day, probably around 3 p.m. Sandro left the apartment at 10 a.m., leaving me alone to wait for the new arrival. Hours went by, 3 p.m., then 4 p.m., 8 p.m., 10 p.m., and still no one. I grabbed a bite to eat, watched a show on Netflix, and eventually decided to go to bed. Around midnight, I was suddenly awakened by knocks on the apartment door. I heard someone coming in. That must be the new student, I thought to myself, before hearing an unfamiliar voice explaining the apartment's layout. I stayed in my room, too tired to go out, and eventually I fell back asleep. But a few minutes later, there were knocks on my door. Once, then a second time, and then 10 minutes later. Thinking that there might be a problem, I eventually got up, and I found myself face to face with a young Japanese woman, around 25 years old. I quickly explained a few details about the apartment. We exchanged Instagram handles, and then each of us went back to our rooms for the night. In the following days, she often asked me to accompany her when taking the bus or the subway. I gladly helped out, showing her the stops and the good spots for getting around, and then returned to my routine between classes and gym sessions. But gradually, something strange started to happen. You see, every evening when I came back, she would always be talking to me, either by message or when we bumped into each other in the apartment. The situation became increasingly heavy too. Then one evening, while lying on my bed, I noticed a figure on the shared balcony right in front of my bedroom window. She was leaning against the railing, staring at me. Her gaze was piercing and unsettling. When she realized that I had seen her, she quickly turned away and went back into her room. I sort of shivered at that, but I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. Later, around midnight, as I turned off the lights to fall asleep, I glanced out the window again, and she was still there, standing, watching me. Our eyes met again, and she vanished instantly. The scene repeated itself the following nights. Every evening I would watch her watching me from the balcony, always at the same time, always with that fixed gaze. And every time she disappeared as soon as she realized that I had noticed her, but the night before my departure, the situation took an even more disturbing turn. One morning I had to get up particularly early for an appointment. It was about 5:30 in the morning when I left my room, and the entire apartment was shrouded in darkness, except for the faint light filtering from underneath the bathroom door, where I was brushing my teeth, when suddenly I heard a noise behind me. The young woman emerged from her room, silent, her footsteps softly echoing on the wooden floor. She knew that I was there, and she saw the light under the door. I froze, a chill running down my spine all of a sudden. There I was, in my underwear, toothbrush in hand, wondering what she wanted. But instead of turning back, she opened the bathroom door and came in, sitting on the closed toilet facing me. She didn't say a word either. She just sat there, motionless, her gaze locked into mine, with a blank, almost empty expression. The scene dragged on for long, icy seconds where the silence grew oppressive. Then, slowly, I gathered myself and I left the room, closing the door behind me. I returned to my room very slowly, trying to show that I didn't understand what was going on, but her English was too poor for us to have a proper conversation. In the days that followed, I became increasingly cautious, watching her every move, but she continued to observe me every evening from the balcony like a disturbing shadow in the night. Until, on the night before my departure, things took an even more terrifying turn. So I was having dinner in my room when I saw her again through the window, staring intensely inside. I looked away, hoping that she would just leave like she always did. Then, later that night at around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly from a nightmare. I turned my head and there she was, still on the balcony, her her eyes wide open now, fixed on me. For some reason, my blood ran cold. This time, she didn't look away, too. She remained motionless like a statue. Then, abruptly, she turned and started running inside the apartment. My heart pounded. I rushed to lock my door, and I buried myself under the covers, hoping that it was all just a bad dream. But a few seconds later, I heard footsteps behind my door. Then an attempt to open it, gently at first, then more forcefully. She was pressing on the handle, trying to get into my room. Panicked, I remained still, holding my breath, and then everything went silent again. I heard nothing more. She must have gone back to her room, I guess, but that night it felt endless. I returned to France the next day, and she was no longer in the apartment for whatever reason. I don't know what was up with her. I guess maybe she was fascinated to see a European. That's my best guess, but something tells me that there was more to it. Her eyes were just wild, and she seemed, well, sinister to say the least. Anyway, I also thought that she might have been looking for an adventure with me or trying to steal my passport or something. Again, I'm not entirely sure, but do take care, everyone. This is a story that I'll never forget, and I hope it helps others to stay alert and aware when traveling, because you just never know who you might come into contact with. So I've had a handful of paranormal experiences in my life that it could all be chalked up to anxiety, an overactive imagination, or maybe even being high once or twice. Well, all except for one. It was pretty minor, but I still haven't been able to explain it, no matter how I racked my brain over it. So back when I was a kid and still a Christian, specifically of the evangelical flavor, I'd often theorize about things that I'd read in the Bible, as if it were any of the other stories I'd like to do that with. My church mates and pastors were not fans of my hot Christian lore takes, if you were wondering, but one notion that I'd taken to was the idea that demons, they scare people because that's what gives them power to escalate and do everything else. So, the few times I found myself in a situation that I decided might be paranormal, my approach was to firmly and pointedly ignore it. My childhood best friend lived in a house that she had strange experiences in, as did her dad. According to her, she often heard footsteps, felt like she was being watched, things went missing and showed up in odd places, random chills in the air, that sort of thing. Pretty stereotypical ghost tropes. I did hear the footsteps once, but that could have been the house sounds. I definitely experienced the random chills, though, and sudden distinct feeling of being watched and loomed over, but that could have been anxiety as well. And you know how fear can be sort of contagious around other people, especially if you're already predisposed to believe in ghosts and demons? Well, I definitely had nightmares more often in that house, but that could have been subconscious fears, right? I heard children laughing once, but I do have an overactive imagination and have had audible hallucinations more than a handful of times, I think. But the one thing that I could never explain was this. So I had been coming to this house since about age 8, and I was now 18. I was staying with my friend and her dad for a few months. I wanted to try living somewhere that wasn't with my parents for a while, and I was alone in the house at the time. I was on my computer, and I heard some sort of an odd banging sound. Immediately after, I got that being loomed over feeling, that sort of being stared at feeling, and oddly enough, I got the distinct notion that something was very angry. I responded by cranking my computer volume all the way up on my headphones, of course, and putting on an ASDF movie compilation. As somebody who did a lot of maladaptive daydreaming and had already gotten used to ignoring scary things that I didn't like, I was able to pretty quickly remove my mind from the situation. Except, that angry feeling just never seemed to go away this time. I didn't dwell on it, but it was definitely still present, and as I refused to acknowledge it, I distinctly remember feeling that anger sort of swell. And then, the weirdest thing happened. Completely alone in the house, a penny was pitched at the back of my head hard enough that it left a tiny goose egg afterwards. You'd think that would freak me out, and I did startle, of course, but immediately afterward I just actually burst out laughing. I think that I said something along the lines of, "Paranormal Activity really hyped you guys up, didn't it?" And then promptly returned to watching stickmen vomit rainbows. The feeling dissipated after that. I remember noticing sometime later too that I never got any weird feelings in the house anymore unless I was around my friend. I'm still dubious about the paranormal, and to be quite honest, I'd be outright dismissive if it weren't for that damn penny. To this day, it still bothers me deeply, and I genuinely just have no way to explain it. So I fell out of contact with my brother about 15 years ago due to how my parents are. We recently got back into contact and started catching up, and before getting into this, I should probably let you know that I have a love for the paranormal, and my brother thinks that it's all fake, or at least did until we got to talking about the room that we both inhabited at one point or another. So the house that we lived in was old, built sometime in the 40s, and was renovated several times before my parents got it. It was a 2-bedroom, but one of the bedrooms was also the path to the bathroom, and it was the kids' room, since the parents wanted the privacy of the other room. My brother was out of the house in 2001 after he graduated, and I got the room afterward. A long story short, my parents made the dining room their bedroom until my brother left, and was genuinely unsettled all of my childhood because of the things that I saw there. This is just the setup to the mutual experience, but I had to get that out. So one night when I was 14, I saw a man much taller than my father standing in the doorway of my room. I was frozen in bed, unable to make out what it could have been. I actually asked if it was my father, but it slowly moved out of view, and my dad is a bit of a jerk, and I had recently gotten into trouble for sneaking a horror movie that I don't remember the name of, and figured that he wanted to just scare me out of ever doing it again, and so I went back to sleep. The following morning, I asked if it was him, and he replied that it wasn't, and both him and my mother both looked a little shaken when I told them. I saw it twice more in my life, but figured that it must have been my overactive imagination, and so I just pushed it out. Cut to this year though, and I told my brother about it, and when I did, he went pale and silent for a moment, before telling me that he had seen the figure as well, back when he lived in that room as a younger teen, and he also had some of the similar frights that I had over the years, like a mirror incident. And when I asked my parents, they finally admitted to having seen the man as well at one point, but figured that it was just exhaustion. That house had a list of bizarre things happen in it, but I just wanted to share this one experience that was verified by multiple people. This is my story about being stalked. Dealing with this has been difficult, and throughout the ordeal I felt, well, really out of control. So I'm sharing this as a part to gain control over my story. It's long and it's spanned over 2 years, so I've split it into parts to make it easier to listen to. So part 1. Several years ago, I moved abroad to begin a 2-year study course. When I arrived at my apartment, I met 3 of my roommates. Sam was funny and sarcastic, while Bella and Poppy were both nice. The sorority-type girls, I guess you could say. Well, we decided to go out for dinner, and I offered to invite our 4th roommate in room 1C next to mine. Sam warned me not to invite her, though, saying that she was odd. I was worried because I didn't want to live with a bunch of catty girls. How were they fighting in less than a day, right? I smiled and told Sam that she just made a bad first impression and I would invite her to get to know her better. Sam grumbled as I left the kitchen, approaching the door next to mine. I knocked and the door opened. A short, petite girl with long brown hair and a childlike face stuck her head out. I introduced myself and invited her to dinner. The girl's face lifted at my invitation as she nodded in agreement. Our excitement about the new school year kept us lively as we arrived at the restaurant. I decided to befriend the girl in room 1C since we were sharing a bathroom anyway. I learned that her name was Nellie. We were the same age, from the same state, and in the same program. I ordered a Jack and Coke as Nellie leaned into me and asked if I actually drank alcohol. I nodded, thinking that her question was a bit odd. We were both in our 20s after all. I mean, of course I drank alcohol. Nellie focused her attention on me while we ate, though. As I got to know Nellie, I kind of felt bad for her, to be honest. She was born in Sri Lanka, but immigrated as a kid, and since she had an accent and a lisp, I assumed that she must have been bullied. Nellie was different from me, though. She was shy and claimed to not have hobbies or friends, but I figured that since we were in the same program, I could befriend her. I asked if she wanted to sit with me in class, and she happily agreed. I felt content knowing that I was befriending her, like I was doing a good deed, I guess. Part 2. My first 2 weeks abroad went smoothly. I got used to my surroundings, made friends, and got along with my roommates. Sam, Bella, Poppy, and I would often cook and eat dinner together while chatting about our days. Nellie and I got along, but she was socially awkward. I made it my goal to befriend her, which was easy enough because we sat together in lecture every day. We even opened our bedroom doors in unison, and I would open my door and then Nellie would open hers and ask me where I was going. Now one night, I left my room to go grocery shopping when Nellie's door opened and she asked to join me. I agreed and she hurriedly put on her sandals and neon pink coat. I walked through the aisle, Nellie silently following closely behind me. Eventually I found everything that I needed, but Nellie said that she wasn't buying anything. After I paid for everything, we began to exit the store and the alarms went off. I stopped to show the security guard my receipt and he looked in my bags, confirming that I hadn't stolen anything, as if I ever would anyway, but I didn't think much of this incident. But when I stood at the front of the store with Nellie for the 4th time, as my bags were being searched by security, a thought crept into my mind. The alarms never rang when I was alone or with friends. They only ever rang when I was with Nellie. I shook my head. Nellie couldn't be stealing. Of course, I wasn't with her the whole time, but she was a perfectly nice, normal girl, and I was rude to even think anything contrary. Part 3. The harmony in the apartment only lasted 2 weeks. One morning, I shuffled into the bathroom and saw that the toilet was completely filled with 2 or 3 rolls of dry, unraveled toilet paper spilling onto the floor. However, what concerned me the most was the huge wad of hair that sat directly on top of the toilet paper. I knew then that it was Nellie who had done this. She was the only other person with a bathroom key and her hair color was a match. I tried to think of any reason that Nellie would do this. Maybe she clogged the toilet, then stuffed it with toilet paper to hide her business, but that didn't explain the wad of hair. I couldn't harp on the issue though, so I made a maintenance request to have someone unclog the toilet, and when I came home from class, the toilet was unclogged. I studied for 2 hours before going back to the bathroom. I was annoyed when I found the toilet clogged again though, toilet paper, hair and all. This obviously wasn't a mistake anymore, and now we were out of toilet paper as well. I knew that I had to say something, but I didn't want to directly confront Nellie about this awkward topic, so I sent a positive, non-aggressive text. I wrote, "Hey, if something goes wrong with the toilet, can you make a maintenance request right away, please?" I sent the message, careful not to make it accusatory. I didn't want there to be tension with Nellie, especially since she still sat with me in class. Nellie, she never acknowledged the situation though. She still opened her door with mine, hung out with me and sat with me in class. For the next 2 months, I just dealt with the constant toilet paper and torn out hair. I tried sending more texts, but It just never seemed to help. Nellie would clog the toilet, I'd make a maintenance request, a staff member would clean Nellie's mess, and then she would do it all over again. Eventually, after 12 clogged toilets, I was so annoyed that I decided to confront Nellie finally. I wrote, "Nellie, I know you're clogging the toilet and you need to stop. If you do it again, I have to report you." I pressed send as I walked to class. I decided then too that I wouldn't sit with Nellie anymore. I had different friends to sit with anyway who didn't clog my toilet, and as I sat down with Reagan and Charlotte, I felt bad seeing Nellie sit alone across the lecture hall like that, but I promised myself that I'd still be friends with her and that everything would be fine. It would all work itself out. Part 4. I was happy that the holiday break was soon and that Nellie never addressed me not sitting with her. My message had worked too. Nellie had stopped clogging the toilet and we were still friends. But I came home one day in early December and instantly my nose scrunched in disgust. There was a sickly sweet sort of rotten yogurt-like smell coming from Nellie's room. I didn't want to confront Nellie so soon after messaging her about the toilet, so for about 2 weeks I just avoided the problem. I didn't address the issue until 2 weeks later when all of our food started to rot almost immediately after buying it. Bella, Sam and Poppy, they were complaining about how maintenance hadn't found the source of what was causing our food to rot, when I brought up the horrible smell and an accompanying fly infestation. The girls went to go and smell the hallway outside of Nellie's room, and returned a minute later coughing and gagging. We posited about what may be causing the smell, when Sam brought up seeing Nellie at 2 a.m. skipping through the woods. Sam was heading back from the club apparently, and Nellie was skipping around like a possessed doll, according to Sam at least. As we spoke, Nellie entered the kitchen and everybody fell silent. Sam bluntly asked Nellie what the smell in her room was, and Nellie just silently shrugged her shoulders. Annoyed by this, Sam stood up and grabbed Nellie's arm, guiding her into the hallway as the rest of us followed, covering our noses with our sleeves. Nellie claimed not to smell anything, but her eyes were darting rapidly between the three of us. Sam made a sarcastic comment toward Nellie as we returned to the kitchen without Nellie. Sam was a bit harsh, I'll admit, and part of me felt bad for Nellie, but at least Christmas would be relaxing and hopefully we could all, get along a little better. I spent 2 weeks at a friend's house with her family for Christmas. They were all welcoming, so I didn't miss home too much. My friend knew about Nellie, so she bought me some scented candles for Christmas, funnily enough. And when I returned to the apartment, I felt rested and equipped to face the new year. Part 5. My January exams were online and pretty easy, so I was surprised when Nellie texted me asking if I would cheat with her on the final exam. I politely declined this, and she asked if I would go to lunch the next day. I had no plans, so I accepted her invitation. I spent a lot of time with her, but she never actually spoke much, really. And despite everything, I still wanted to get to know her better. Once we were at the restaurant, I racked my brain for things that I could talk with Nellie about, attempting to break the awkward silence a bit. So I asked her what her favorite show was. Nellie told me that she loves to watch Sophia the First. I was confused. Sophia the First is a Disney toddler show that came out when we were like teens. Why was she watching a show for toddlers in her 20s? I didn't know how to expand on what she said, so I just changed the topic and asked what her favorite hobby was. Nellie giggled and said, "I do this a lot actually. I listen to you through the walls. They're so thin I barely put my ear against it and I can hear you talk to your parents every day." I tried not to look horrified as I sat there confused and genuinely a little bit scared. Nellie started laughing. "You're like a mother, but I'm an aunt and we're sisters together." I smiled awkwardly at that and nodded. I genuinely had no clue how to respond. In a desperate attempt to change topics, I asked her about her childhood in Sri Lanka. Nellie suddenly slammed her fists on the table, sending my rice flying off the plate. Nellie yelled that she was not from Sri Lanka, and I apologized, even though she definitely told me that she was from Sri Lanka. Nellie began to laugh again. "I have plans for us tonight. We'll go to the graveyard and walk around. You'll be scared, but I'll have fun with you." Nellie's eyes were opened incredibly wide, and her mouth seemed to open more than usual when she said this. She was scaring me, and I didn't want to be rude, so I said that I'd invite our other roommates too. At that, Nellie let go of her fork and quickly moved her hand onto mine. She insisted that we had to go alone. I pulled my hand back, attempting to hide my grimace, and stuttered out a disingenuous maybe. Nellie leaned back slowly, rolling her head from one side to the other, and mumbled about how fun it will be. The rest of our lunch was silent. When we got back to the apartment, I said goodbye to her and I went into my room. I didn't call my parents that night. I went to bed early instead, hoping to quell my anxiety and get some much-needed rest. Part 6. So the next day, I did laundry, went shopping, and by 2 p.m. I was meal prepping for the week. I jumped when Nellie asked me to go to the movies with her. I hadn't heard her come into the kitchen, but there she stood, her head down and eyes turned up staring at me. I declined her request, but she repeated her question. I politely declined once again, trying to offset her bizarre vibe. Nellie didn't respond and retreated back to her room, though, then left for the movies. An hour later, I went to the bathroom, and when I opened the door, I gagged immediately. The smell was terrible, but the sight was even worse. The walls, floors, door, sink, and toilet were covered in smeared poop and blood. I could see distinct handprints. I closed the door, trying not to puke. I was shocked that Nellie had done this, but my shock turned to anger as I messaged Nellie. I said, "What you did is weird and disgusting. You need to clean it. I'm going to report you." And I pressed send. It was at this moment that I no longer cared about being friends with Nellie. I felt gross, so I went to our shower room next to the bathroom, but Nellie had ruined that too. There was toilet paper shoved in the shower drain and wads of toilet paper crusted onto the walls. I was livid at this point, but I had to wait until Monday to report it. So I laid down to take a nap instead. 2 hours later, I was woken by Nellie slamming the front door. I heard her footsteps until her feet were visible through the crack under my door. I expected her to knock, but she didn't. Instead, Nellie began to continuously chirp like a bird. She briefly paused, then began twisting my doorknob in unison with her chirps. I stood there unnerved, as Nellie did this for about 5 minutes. Then Nellie began to rapidly knock on my door and call my phone. 7 times she called, hung up, and then called again, while still rapidly knocking. Nellie then began to ram her body into my door over and over again. The shock of it made me stumble back into my bed. Then, as suddenly as it had started, Nellie stopped, her feet still visible under my door. My phone buzzed, and I slowly unlocked it, staring down in horror at Nellie's text. She wrote, "The cockroach screamed, 'Why do this to me?' Because you couldn't be positive in a negative situation," the doctor said. The doctor pulls off the cockroach legs and it cries. The doctor has no choice. The cockroach must be killed and its family taken away. You are the funny cockroach. I was terrified as Nellie began to knock and chirp again. I was scared to call the cops because I was on a visa, and if they didn't believe me, I could be deported for making a false report. I texted Poppy and Bella, who had heard everything. Nellie stood there for about an hour straight, occasionally pushing her fingers through the crack under my door. When Bella's boyfriend arrived, His presence scared Nellie away. We met up and talked about what had just happened before going to bed, and that night, I can tell you that I barely slept. I was way too scared to close my eyes. Part 7. I awoke the next day anxious about the previous night's events. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't that bad. However, as I peeked into the bathroom, its condition suggested otherwise. Charlotte and Reagan were skipping class, so I sat alone. I saw Nellie enter the room, bypass her regular seat, weave through the aisles and inspect each row as she passed. I sort of sank in my chair as she got closer, horrified by the realization that she was searching for me. With the last night's memories fresh in my mind, I froze in fear when Nellie found me and robotically bent down to meet me at eye level as she sat next to me with her mouth twisted up in a sinister smile. I did nothing as she sat next to me, too scared to move and worried that any tiny shift may cause her to snap. When the professor dismissed us, I shot up, frantically packing my things. Nellie asked where I was going, and I lied to her, saying that I was going to the cafe. I didn't want her to know where I was, so I went home for lunch, and as I stood in the kitchen, the door opened. "You weren't at the cafe?" Nellie's eyes darted up at me. She was looking at a knife on the table. I apologized and told Nellie my plans had changed. My heart raced as I asked her if she liked the lecture. Nellie didn't respond though. She just stared with her head tilted and mouth agape. I asked again, but she still didn't answer. I faced her, afraid that she'd use the knife on me all of a sudden. She glared so intently that her veins were protruding. She stood there for a total of about 10 minutes before just turning around and leaving. Later on, I walked to the library and froze as I saw Nellie's pink jacket behind me. I turned to see Nellie staring at me with vacant eyes. She followed me into the library, up to the 3rd floor, and then sat directly behind me. With her threat still fresh in my mind, I decided to move to a different spot. But Nellie followed me. I tried again, but she still followed. I was scared to be isolated in a library with her, so I decided to leave. I quickly weaved through the bookshelves, desperately trying to reach the lobby, but Nellie matched my pace. I was nearing a heart attack when I ran into my guardian angel, Sam. "Nellie's following me," I blurted out. Sam looked at Nellie, who had stopped 5 feet behind me. Sam nonchalantly told Nellie to get lost. I was surprised when Nellie did just that too. After Sam and I spoke for a bit, my phone buzzed. It was Nellie, inviting me to the graveyard that night. Sam told me that I'd be smart to move out, and honestly, they were right. I needed to report Nellie and move out. It wasn't safe for me to live in that apartment anymore. I needed to get away. Part 8. I went to Reagan's apartment as she was the closest person that I had to family while I was abroad. She gave me refuge while listening to me retell the last 48 miserable hours of my life. She reassured me that I could stay with her, and as I held back tears, my phone buzzed. Sam texted that they needed help and to go to the apartment ASAP. I was hesitant to go back in there, but I couldn't just abandon Sam. So I grabbed my stuff and told Reagan that I'd be back soon. I walked to my apartment and stared up at it, feeling a lot like the priest in the Exorcist movie. When I got to my door, I was immediately greeted by my 3 roommates with distraught faces. I followed them into the apartment, and my eyes grew wide as Sam pushed open the kitchen door to reveal a truly demonic sight. Huge amounts of congealed blood and orange liquid pooled across the floor leading beneath our table, where a small bird lay dead with its wings outstretched and its head missing. I felt sick. The windows don't open, so it didn't get in here by itself, that's for sure. Nellie had either found this bird and brought it into the kitchen, or she killed and decapitated a living bird and then put it in the kitchen. I didn't like either of those options, and I assured my roommates that I would report Nellie that night, and that's exactly what I did. I spoke to the school safety board, and things moved quickly. I discovered that Nellie had lied to us about her name and age. Officials in hazmat suits came to clean the kitchen and Nellie's room. The board had me send them photos of myself daily in case Nellie killed me, and they had to identify me. I quickly moved out, and since Nellie avoided the other girls, they decided to stay. I declined to submit Nellie for expulsion because I felt bad for her, and I thought that moving would stop her obsession with me, but again, I was incredibly misguided. Part 9. I was happy that my new roommates were normal and no Nellie's incidences had happened for 2 weeks. I did have a large uptick in random daily Facebook and Instagram follower requests from blank profile users. I knew who was behind this, but I was avoiding Nellie-related thoughts, and I was having night terrors, and the more I thought about her, the worse they got. I blocked another user as I sat down with Reagan and Charlotte in an almost empty lecture hall. Charlotte nudged me as Nellie entered the room, bypassing her usual seat. I felt myself freeze up as she entered our row and began walking toward me, staring at me with her dead eyes. "Don't sit next to me," I said, shocked by my bravery. Nellie responded by sitting 10 seats down from me, not breaking eye contact, and I considered that a win. After class, I went home and then walked to the store. I forgot to grab a cart, so I quickly turned around to fetch one and ran into someone standing directly behind me. It was Nellie. Did she follow me from my apartment? Does she know where I live? My heart stopped as I backed into another aisle, and Nellie followed. I walked to another aisle, but Nellie followed me again, matching my pace until I went to another aisle and she began to run. I ran away terrified, and Nellie only stopped when I got to the security desk. Security offered to call the police, but I declined and gave them my email to send me the footage of Nellie chasing me. I had to report Nellie, but since I still had class that day, I decided to report her the next day. 2 hours later, as I waited for Reagan to walk with me to class, I caught Nellie staring at me across the street. But she didn't approach me and walked with a crowd toward campus. Minutes later, Reagan found me and we headed to class together. I walked beside Reagan, past the buildings and alleyways until a rock caught in my shoe and I bent down to fix it. Reagan switched to the right side of me to look at a billboard, and when I removed the rock, we began to walk again. I turned my head to speak when Nellie literally jumped out of an alleyway and onto Reagan. Her hands were outstretched and clasped around Reagan's neck. Words cannot explain how terrified I was in that moment. Nellie let go immediately and Reagan grabbed my arm, walking forward. Nellie began walking shoulder to shoulder with me, her head turned sideways at an unnatural angle. The look in her eyes was not human. Reagan told me to run and we bolted across the street. Nellie paused but walked away, traffic stopping her from crossing. We stopped and Reagan leaned against the fence as I bent over and covered my mouth, trying not to vomit. After a while, we continued our walk to class in silence. We made it to the lobby and headed for the staircase, but Nellie suddenly stood at the bottom of it. "I won't let her walk behind me," I said, voice shaking. Reagan nodded, and we followed a large crowd after Nellie walked upstairs, only to find her holding the door open for everyone. Nellie stared at me through the crowd until everyone but Reagan and I had passed through. "It's okay, you can go first," Reagan said, while smiling at Nellie. I was shocked at how composed she was, and even more shocked that Nellie listened. When we sat down in class, Nellie tried to sit behind me, but someone was saving the seat for his friend, so Nellie left. I didn't pay any attention to that lecture. I sat there shocked and terrified the whole time, while Reagan hunched low in her seat, rubbing her neck. I felt horrible for bringing Reagan into this Nellie stuff, but I knew then that Nellie needed to be expelled, no matter what. Part 10. The next day, I reported Nellie to the Student Safety Board, and they raised the issue to the Disciplinary Board. I submitted a lengthy report detailing everything Nellie had done. I included Reagan, Bella, Poppy, and Sam as witnesses, and gave photographic evidence of the threats, the calls, the smeared poop and blood, clogged showers and toilets, and the stalking. The next week, I met with the Disciplinary Board to go over their conclusions with them. They informed me that they had reviewed my report, met with Nellie to give her a copy of my report, discussed my accusations, and had come to a conclusion. They acknowledged that everything that I reported was factual, but they didn't think that Nellie had any malicious intent. So they would grant a no-contact order, but Nellie wouldn't be expelled. I was completely perplexed by their conclusion, and asked them what Nellie had said about all of this, but they refused to tell me anything. Genuinely, I was at a loss for words about this. I couldn't believe that Nellie was given my full report, knew everything that I had said, and knew the witnesses' names too. The school, as far as I was concerned, had put us all in danger. Yet, they wouldn't allow me to know if Nellie had even denied her actions. I was devastated. I felt my mind go numb. I knew at that moment that they didn't care, that they were going to prioritize a predator over us. But with really no other options, I agreed to the no-contact order. The worker tried to get me to sign a non-disclosure agreement so that I wouldn't speak about what Nellie had done to me or how the school dealt with my case, but I refused to sign it. The next day, I received an email confirmation that Nellie had agreed to the no-contact order, but I knew then that that meant nothing. Nellie wouldn't get help and she would not stop stalking me. That much was clear. Part 11. My sophomore year was plagued by a relentless pattern of Nellie stalking me from place to place, sitting next to me in class, standing next to me in hallways, and staring at me daily. Her actions were so unnerving and obvious that multiple strangers warned me about her. I reported these incidences every time that they occurred, and the school always responded by stating that they would remind Nellie of the no-contact order, and they never took any further steps to help me. In sophomore year, Nellie found other roommates, and in them, new victims, unfortunately. She was evicted from an off-campus apartment, and her new roommates, who once sat with her, began to sit far away from Nellie. They genuinely looked terrified too. They looked a lot like me. Having incidences happen weekly and having to see Nellie daily made it impossible for me to move on. I was always in flight or freeze mode, terrified by what Nellie had done and still might do to me. I became a sunken-in, miserable and defeated version of myself. But I wanted revenge. The natural result of the boiling rage that I felt, I know, but now at a constant simmer after Nellie was coddled by a university that failed to shell out even a minor consequence for the terror that she had imposed on me. I wanted Nellie to suffer in the exact same way that she had made me suffer. I know that if I had just grown a pair at any point in those early months, I likely could have saved myself and others from suffering. Nellie was likely stalking me from the moment that I met her. I just hadn't realized it, and it weighs heavily on me to know that I played a large part in my own suffering. No matter what I share here, I cannot begin to recreate the evil that just radiated off of Nellie. I still have daily night terrors. I don't go into new situations lightly. I don't speak to new people, and I don't really make any new friends. I'm also not nice to strangers because I don't want to invite something like this into my life ever again. But revenge, it came on graduation day, when Nellie's name didn't appear in the book of the graduates. She had failed her second year, but despite everything, and I know this is going to sound a bit weird, I couldn't help but think that I was a bad person for being content with Nellie failing. Who knows though, maybe I was just happy that I could finally move on. I travelled to Chicago once to visit some old friends. This was around 2015. I went out on the town with my buddy Kyla. I was not one to get wasted, and I never knew her to be that type either. And that made this night, well, kind of strange, really. You see, she took me to what she called a punk bar in a neighborhood that I'd never visited. Cool, I like punk bars. But this was no punk bar, really. It was more a goth bar, mostly staffed by cross-dressing stripper types. Unexpected, but I was down for the experience. We each got a drink and found a table, and before I knew it, the night completely unraveled. We wound up getting physically threatened by a 6-foot-tall man in high heels, who looked like he was demonically possessed. Something overcame me, and I almost threw a large glass object at him before Kyla intervened and tried to convince me to leave. This sort of reaction from me was, well, completely irrational and atypical. I really don't know what overcame me, except extreme anger toward this person who was yelling at us for no reason and flipping me off. But the even stranger person was this random man across the bar. He stood probably about 40 feet away on the other side, and he was just absolutely bizarre to me. I initially thought, oh, he's handsome in an unusual way, but then I saw his eyes and was horrified. They were completely black and slanted upward, and he looked at me like he hated me. For the next hour or so, Kyla and I continued to get a second drink, even though we both wanted to leave. Something anchored us there, and we sat there uncomfortably, speaking to each other, not knowing why we just didn't go someplace else. Every time I looked up, this strange man with jet black eyes was glaring at me from a different part of the bar. I was overcome with strange thoughts, too. I started having these weird thoughts of maybe I should go to that hallway and wait for him. And then my rational mind thought, what the heck? No, why would I do that? And this internal argument carried on for a while. I fought the urge to go into some dark corner and just wait for this weirdo to approach me. I actually wanted nothing to do with him. He was creeping me out and scaring me, but I also felt compelled to do something against my own best interests. It felt like there were intrusive thoughts getting into my brain and telling me to do something I 100% did not want to do. Finally, Kyla literally pulled me out of the bar and got us an Uber to go back to our Airbnb. And well, after that, I blacked out at that point. Apparently, though, it was a very bizarre ride where I got us lost several times. The first Uber driver dumped us off in a strange part of town, refusing to continue. The second one finally looked at our Airbnb listing on my phone and got us to the right place, which was on the other side of the city. Poor Kyla spent about $100 on these follies. This dragged on for hours, allegedly, and I don't remember a thing. And I only had 2 drinks. I had been a social drinker for years by this point. There was just no reason that 2 drinks would have done this to me. Well, the next day I woke up and needed to get back on the train to continue my travels. And I have never felt more physically awful in my entire life. I was so ill that I contemplated going to the hospital. On the L ride to the Amtrak station, we were sat across from the schizophrenic man who shouted at us the entire time about the alternate reality that he was living in. Nothing felt worse than enduring his ranting for an hour while I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. I want to say, too, that there probably was something slipped into my drink, but I also cannot forget about the deranged look and behavior of that cross-dresser who accosted us for no reason, and I definitely cannot get the image out of my head of that horrifying guy with the black slanted eyes who was just staring at me. It didn't hit me until years later, too, that, well, maybe I was encountering a room full of demons that night. This started when I was at my childhood friend's apartment for what was supposed to be a fun little movie night. We hadn't hung out in a while, and we were just catching up. Her place was cozy, a little disorganized, and full of girly decor. But we were in our comfiest sweatpants about to watch princess movies. Her apartment isn't the most tidy. Things are a bit scattered around, but it's clean and really authentic, which always made me feel at home. But we decided that night on ordering pizza for dinner too. She mentioned that Sherwood, someone that I hadn't met yet, would bring the pizza over. At first, I was not happy to hear that. I thought maybe that she had invited other friends, a boy, over to join us, which wasn't what I had in mind for the night. But boy, I was in for a surprise. Sherwood turned out to be just our delivery guy for the night. He wasn't joining us, in other words. When he got to the apartment, there was this awkward air about him too. He was obviously nervous, fumbling a bit with the pizza boxes, and not quite making eye contact too. My friend introduced us quickly, and it was clear from her overly thankful demeanor that Sherwood did a lot more for her than just fetch dinner. Well, after handing us the pizza, there was this brief moment of forced small talk. My friend was super nice to him despite his awkwardness. He wasn't the best conversationalist and seemed really out of place. Then Sherwood asked for my number, and I was in a tough spot because our mutual friend was sitting right there, so I just gave it to him. Yeah, we chatted for maybe 5 minutes before my friend gave him a cue to leave with something like, "Thanks so much for dropping this off." He seemed to get the hint, and we both gave him a hug before my friend said something like "drive safe," giving him another kind of cue to leave. When I asked my friend what that was all about, she basically explained that Sherwood was her unpaid personal assistant. He did her grocery shopping, he dropped off pizza, and he did all this other stuff too. I think that Sherwood was just a really lonely guy desperate for interaction, especially female interaction. My friend and I were both young and immature back then. We were about 23, but I think we both knew something was seriously wrong with Sherwood right from the get-go. It was a little hard to articulate though, because we couldn't really point out exactly what his problem was. In any case, Sherwood started a group chat with my friend and me. He just sent a meme or two every other week, and it felt like he was trying to just stay relevant without being intrusive. Maybe he was used to being sidelined or even blocked by other girls in the past, who knows. But it felt like he was trying to make me remember him, but also carefully trying not to give me a reason to block him too. I cannot speak on his behalf, obviously, but that's just what it felt like. Sherwood also offered to help with errands, and this first time I said, "Thanks for asking, but no." He asked every weekend after that, and one day, unfortunately, I made the mistake of accepting his help. I knew better, but I had recently found a great deal for a new washing machine on Craigslist, but truthfully, I had no idea how to pick it up or install it. When I mentioned it in the chat, Sherwood excitedly volunteered to take care of the whole thing. He handled the whole pickup and installation like a total champ, which saved me so much hassle. I tried to pay him for his efforts because I wanted to show appreciation, but he wouldn't accept any money. I insisted even, but eventually he suggested that I could repay him by joining him for a hike. And that was really weird. I was uneasy about this. It felt a bit too personal and almost like it could be mistaken for a date. But Sherwood framed it as nothing more than a friendly outing, like a transaction to balance out the favor. So in the end, I agreed to the hike. I rationalized it by telling myself that it was a fair trade for installing the washing machine and that it was genuinely a form of payment, especially since I didn't think that he had too many friends. This hike felt like maybe a way for him to have some companionship, I guess. I thought that it might be nice helping him. Part of me was still uneasy, I won't lie, about spending time with him in such an isolated setting, but like I said, I convinced myself. So, the day of the hike, Sherwood picked this trail that was nearby. I had been there before, and honestly, it was gorgeous. As we walked along together, he chatted about ordinary things like work, the weather, and his hobbies. Everything seemed, well, normal. Until he suggested we go off the main path to see something special that he wanted to share. Like, what could that even mean? Well, we reached this secluded spot, and there, right there, just sitting there, was a dead body. My heart pounded suddenly so violently as Sherwood stood there, so eerily calm and nonchalant. The casualness in his demeanor made me feel even more uneasy. It felt like he wasn't just showing me a dead body, but was also revealing his darker side of himself. Man, it smelled bad too, but not like in the movies. I didn't know how long it had been there. I'm not a biologist, but my guess is that it had smelled a lot worse before, but now it had gone down. At that moment, I mumbled some excuse about needing to get back quickly and started walking briskly towards the main path. I was urging Sherwood to follow me. I thought that maybe this was some twisted mind game, like a way to intimidate me or show that he wasn't just some harmless little boy. Maybe he was trying to send a message that said, "You should know I'm familiar with things like this." Or there's another possibility too. Maybe he just wanted me to think about him more or something. Sometimes when I talk to people, I feel like they only notice me for the time that we're together, and then they won't think of me again until the next time that we meet. It's possible that Sherwood felt that way with me, and maybe he thought that showing me something like this, a dead body, would make him less forgettable. Truthfully, I have no idea, but on the surface, he seemed oblivious to how inappropriate this was. As we walked back together, I was in full flight or fight mode, instinctively looking around to see if there were other hitchhikers or rangers or anyone who could make me feel like I wasn't alone. The moment that I spotted someone else on the trail, I called out. Not to expose Sherwood, but just asking for directions back to the parking area. I wanted to make sure that Sherwood and I wouldn't be left alone together. I asked this gentleman to walk us back to the parking lot. I wasn't going to take no for an answer too. I kept pretending like I was confused about his directions, and eventually he agreed to just walk us there. Getting help from that guy was my way of re-anchoring myself to safety and normality while I was still under the shock of what Sherwood had actually shown me. We got to the parking area. There I called my friend and told her that I was with Sherwood. I suggested that he could drop me off with her and that we'd be there in 20 minutes, and Sherwood agreed. That was my way of making sure that if anything happened, it was on the record that Sherwood was the last person to have been with me. Also, I immediately texted my friend about what had happened to get that on the record too. When I got to her apartment, we said thanks to Sherwood and kindly told him to go away. I had already told her through text, but then I started going into all the detail with her. The fact that the body had insects, the fact that the face was decomposing but still recognizable, etc. Her reaction was pure horror. Not just about the dead body, but also how nonchalantly Sherwood had treated the whole situation. She confessed that she always sensed that something was off about him, even though she'd never imagined anything this disturbing. We both agreed, though, that we needed to remove Sherwood from our lives. She admitted that she felt stuck and that she had become too reliant on Sherwood to just fire him cold turkey. So we planned on how we could do it. It was this gradual phasing out plan. We would limit our interactions to times when others were present. We would slowly reduce our response to his texts. I would never ask for his help again, that's for sure, and my friend would ask for less and less help too. Sherwood kept texting during weekends, offering to run errands or asking if we needed anything, to which my friend would reply, "I'm trying to work on being more independent, but you've really been such a huge help." Eventually, as my friend started dating someone anew, she introduced Sherwood to her boyfriend, and after that, Sherwood never contacted her again. I had called the cops the same night of the incident, by the way, but it was a while before we heard more news about it. It was at least a full month later that a news report confirmed discovery of a dead body in that area where Sherwood had taken me hiking. They made an arrest, and it wasn't of Sherwood, but of this other guy that Sherwood followed on Instagram. I have no idea if Sherwood was connected to the murder in some way or not, but reflecting on everything, I do think that there's one clear moral of this story. Always trust your instincts. My brother and I were driving between two medium-sized cities late one night a couple of weeks ago. We live in Sweden, so it was pitch black where we were, and on this stretch of the road there was nothing but forest. At this time of the night, the road is pretty empty as well. It's kind of a narrow road without a space on the sides. It has low railings along the sides, and behind them there are high fences to prevent wildlife. So suddenly, as we're driving, we see a person on the side of the railing in our headlights, 10 meters in front of the car, I would guess. My brother was driving about 80 kilometers an hour, so he didn't have a chance to make a maneuver, but we drove by the person no more than half a meter in full speed. And we were shocked. After a few seconds, we both wondered what the heck that was. It happened so fast, but we agreed that it was a young woman dressed in black who was leaning or sitting in a strange way against the railing, and behind her on the other side of the railing stood a man in all black, hugging or holding her from behind with both arms. Behind them was the high fence, as I was speaking about earlier, so how did they even get there? There were no cars nearby, and there wasn't even anywhere to stop with a car, to be honest. Well, after a minute, we decided to call the cops, and they asked us to turn around to see if they were still there. We got back, but unfortunately, they were gone. The police did arrive and started searching with headlights, and we continued driving home. My brother and I were really shaken by this, and honestly, it's still haunting me. What was the deal with these people? Did the guy hold the girl so that she wouldn't run out in front of our car or something? Did the woman try to escape from the man? The only possible way forward for them was in the forest, without lamps in the cold, far away from any houses. In retrospect, it's easy to be wise, and of course, we probably should have stopped at once, but we didn't, and I really regret that. This happened to me when I was really young, somewhere between 3 and 5 years old. I'm not really sure. Back then, 2008 to 2013, my family used to sleep on the floor in the bedroom on the second floor. We couldn't afford proper beds at the time, and it was usually just me, my mother, and my newborn sister in one room. And before my dad passed away, he would usually sleep on the couch in the living room since we didn't have an AC unit back then. We would just leave the doors wide open for the cold air. On this particular night, I randomly woke up out of nowhere. I don't know why, but I just sat up and kind of looked around. Everything was quiet, and it must have been at around 1 or 2 in the morning. The orange glow from our nightlight made everything feel strange and a bit eerie. Then I heard what sounded like slow, faint footsteps or tapping. For some reason, I decided to crawl toward the sound. Maybe I was too young to walk around at night, but I clearly remember crawling on all fours. I stopped in the middle of the hallway and looked around the living room because I thought that's where the sound was coming from. I saw my father on the couch, maybe asleep. Maybe not, I'm not sure, but the room was dim, but I could still make him out. Then I heard the sound again, but now the sound was coming from the sewing room. I turned toward it and crawled all the way up to the doorway, and there was no door back then, just an empty frame, but the second that I reached it, the sound stopped. At that moment, something suddenly felt very wrong. Unlike the hallway or the living room, the sewing room wasn't just dark. It was pitch black, like an empty void. What I mean is that it wasn't just the kind of darkness that you just had to adjust your eyes with. It felt like staring into a wall of just pure blackness, as if the space inside just didn't exist anymore. I couldn't see anything beyond the doorway. I remember just sitting there frozen, staring. I don't know how long I stayed like that, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, but at some point, I saw a hand come out of the darkness. It came out of it, and it was the same pitch black as the room itself. I couldn't see where the arm ended. It just extended from the void, the rest lost inside probably, but it didn't grab me, it just held itself out like it was offering, like it wanted me to take it. I didn't move, I just stared at it. Then, just as suddenly, it instantly retreated. My dad came out of the living room, probably to go to the bathroom, and he saw me sitting there. He asked me what I was doing and picked me up, carried me back to the bedroom and shut the door. And that's where the memory ends. I've tried to write it off as a dream, but I remember everything just so vividly. Every touch, the exact words my dad said. It felt so real. I've never had dreams that come even remotely close to this till now. I'm not saying that it was a ghost or a shadow figure or anything specific. I honestly have no idea what it was. And every time that someone brings up strange or paranormal experiences, this memory always comes back clear as day. Had it not have been for my dad, honestly, I don't know what would have happened. I miss that guy, and I hope that he's resting well. This happened a few years ago, and I've never told anyone about it. At the time, I lived pretty far out in the country, just me and my dog, no close neighbors, and it was usually really quiet. I liked it that way. One night, though, I woke up in the middle of the night to the motion sensor light going off outside. At first, I thought that it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something. But when I looked out of the window, I saw a man standing at the end of my driveway. He wasn't moving, just standing there facing my house. I don't know why, but I sort of froze. I just stood there staring at him and didn't move at all. The light went off after a while and everything went back to dark and quiet. I didn't sleep much after that though, and the next night it happened again. The lights came on and there he was. Same spot, same stillness, just standing there staring at the house. By this point, I was starting to get really freaked out, so I called the sheriff's department and they sent someone out to check it out, but by the time that they got there, he was already gone. The deputy told me that it was probably just some drunk guy or someone passing through and that I shouldn't worry unless he started coming closer. That didn't make me feel any better though, but I tried to move on. This went on for about a week though. Every night, like clockwork, I'd wake up and see him standing there at the end of the driveway. It was always the same too. He never moved, never said anything, just stood there staring at my house. It got to the point where I started closing the blinds at night, but I still felt like I could feel him out there. And then, just like that, so randomly, it stopped. I never saw him again after that week. No explanation, no reason, it just ended. I've never told anyone this before, but it's probably not a big deal. It's just something that stuck with me, and I just thought that I should share it because it is a little bit creepy, right? This happened to me when I was around 13 or 14, so about 14 years ago. We had moved into this house when I was about 6 and I never liked it. I just could never settle in it. I would actually for months when we first moved in, put myself to sleep by repeating there's no such thing as monsters. 2 years later, my little brother was born and when he was around 3 to 4, he moved into my old room and I got the bigger room. He would always wake up screaming, saying that there was a man in the corner of his room trying to light it on fire. We could only ever get him to settle back to sleep if we put on Fireman Sam, the kids' show. Even when he slept in my mum's room, we'd have these episodes of waking up saying someone's in the corner and there's bugs crawling all over the ground. Really creepy stuff, but we thought maybe a bit of a night terror thing or imagination. Anyway, fast forward another 5 or 6 years, I was having breakfast, and my mum tells me that she had such a strange experience the night before, and that she was so scared that she was going to come and sleep with me. She said that she was asleep, but woke up to the sound of someone breathing in her ear. Now, in her sleepy haze for a few seconds, she thought that it was my brother, but then remembered that he was at his dad's. She jumped up and turned the light on, but nobody was there. So I went to school and came home to her burning sage in her room, and her room only. I was like, wouldn't you sage the whole house, yeah? But she only had a little bit left and was going to get some more tomorrow. I didn't think much of it and didn't really believe her story either, to be honest. Until the next morning when I was off sick from school, tonsillitis, and Mum had gone to work. I was happily sitting in my bed playing some Sims when I felt it. Almost a bubble feeling around my head, kind of, like when you're underwater maybe. And then I heard it, this really breathy breathing in my right ear. The one that, if someone was standing beside me, that'd be the ear that they would be breathing in. Now, it wasn't a scary breathing, it was just big, deep breaths, and while I didn't feel threatened, safe to say that I legged it downstairs and I didn't go back up. I rang my mum and told her and stayed downstairs all day until she came home. The woman, though, she forgot the sage. At the time, I thought that that was honestly a huge mistake, and I was like, sure, I'll just get murdered. Thanks, Mum. Anyway, I went to bed and nothing happened, but the next morning, same setup, I was happily playing Sims and it happened again. I remember that I just put my hands up and said, okay, I'm going downstairs, but this time I made sure to take my laptop with me to continue playing The Sims, of course. My mum came home that day with sage and did the whole house, and after that, it didn't happen again, but a few weeks later, my nan bought me a special heat-resistant mug for drinking green tea from. That was our thing at the time, and my mum and me were standing in the kitchen, talking and just making some tea, and I said as I was pouring the water into my new cup to make the tea, "Hey, I think the ghosts are gone." And when I say that I hadn't even put more than a drop of water in, it was barely a splash, and the whole glass just shattered suddenly into a million tiny pieces. My mum and me just sort of looked at each other and laughed and said, "Well, I guess not then." But yeah, that's my story, and nothing else ever happened after that, thankfully. We moved a couple of years later, and then my lovely mum then one day told me, "Oh yeah, when I was younger that house was boarded up and a group of us broke in and did a Ouija board and things started moving around the place, so we ran and we never went back in it again." Good one, Mum, for opening a portal to the spirit world and having us all move in 15 years later, right? So yeah, that's my only paranormal experience, and honestly, hopefully, the last one that I'll ever have. So, I know that this is going to sound a bit weird, but I think that I saw an alien once during the 88 to 89 school year, 3rd grade for me, actually in my school. I had never seen any depictions of greys at that point. I was at school for an after-school art class in the cafeteria at Julius Marx Elementary School, and left the cafeteria to go to the bathroom at some point. I turned a corner to go to the bathroom and felt like someone was watching me, so I turned and looked. And standing in the doorway of the class next door to mine, silhouetted against the light, was someone not human-shaped. They were no more than 4 feet tall, very skinny, with a disproportionately large egg-shaped head, and they had long, thin arms and legs for their size, like a child but not proportioned like a human. Now, I was a brave kid then, especially when I was on my own and didn't have to look out for somebody else. I didn't scare easy, but the whole thing just felt so wrong, so, for a lack of a better term, alien, that I was terrified. I dashed into the bathroom. I must have used the facilities because I was never one to wet myself and I didn't need to go anymore. The weird thing though is that I don't remember anything about when I was in that bathroom. I don't know how I got back to the cafeteria. I cannot remember, although I remember being very afraid and peeking out and there was nothing there. I must have run back to the cafeteria though and told everyone what I had just experienced. That's when I learned about aliens and what they were supposed to look like. One of the other kids drew a picture, and quite honestly, I'm kind of freaked out that I can remember everything clearly, all this detail, except what happened in between running for the bathroom and running through the cafeteria door. Other than a quick glance to see if it was there, obviously. I didn't get the impression that I was gone very long. Like, not even as long as I must have been gone. At least a full 10 minutes, I suppose. On the few occasions I have shared this story over the years, I've only ever gotten one of two reactions. Total disbelief, and the assurance that I was just imagining something that I'd seen on TV or read about, or total belief in the assurance that I was abducted that day, and they must have erased my memory of it. All I can say is that I know for sure that I had never been exposed to any images of greys until that day after my experience. Until that moment, I thought of aliens as being fairly cartoonish in their appearance, and green. Remember that I was only 8 at the time, and it was the 1980s, right before the image of greys became commonplace in US culture. Also, although I cannot remember a lot now, I'm fairly certain that I could remember more until the past 10 years or so, because I had a good sense of how much time had passed, for one. And well, that's enough for me to be fairly certain that I'm not missing time and never was in regards to this incident. Also, I have never had another encounter, have never had any further signs of possible abduction, and have never even seen a UFO. Anyway, that's my once-in-a-lifetime weird alien encounter story. I do have some other stories of other paranormal experiences, and it's why I always try to be skeptical. Maybe I'll share some of those another time, but in any case, have a great evening, everyone, and stay safe. When I was young, I saw something really strange. So I was running late for high school and took a path that I had taken hundreds of times. It's just a street that ends on the side of a park that is surrounded by a wall. It's like a big T-top part being the wall, and you can either turn left or right. Now, walking just ahead of me, there was a man with short hair and a backpack. Instead of turning left or right, he just sort of walked towards the wall. The wall's about 7 feet tall on the side of the road, but just about 2 feet tall on the other side, so you can easily see from the roadside people walking into the park, the benches, etc. The weirdest thing is that this guy didn't walk through the wall. It looked like he was still walking, like one of those things you see in video games where a character is sort of stuck against a wall and starts walking just a few feet above the ground. But then, he just completely vanished. Obviously, I was shocked. I ran towards the wall and looked around, but there was no trace of him. I wasn't high enough to look clearly into the park, so I just assumed that I must have been tired and he just climbed the wall weirdly or something. Well, a few years later, I was in the area again, and I noticed the same guy walking just in front of me. Different outfit, but same bag, same haircut, and I don't know, I just knew that it was him, so I followed him to that same place, and the same thing happened again. I nearly lost it at this stage. It took me a few seconds to compose myself, and I ran to the wall. I was not able to jump to the other side, but I was able to grab the edge and take a bit of a look, and he was not there, anywhere. And there was really nowhere to hide or anything, just grass and some thin trees and a bench. The thing about the guy is that both times I saw him, I noticed that he knew where he was going, so I ran towards the park entrance that was maybe about 40 yards away and went into the same direction, trying to intercept him. On the other side, there was this big plaza, again nowhere to hide, and strangely at that hour it was nearly empty. There was no trace of him. not by the road, not at the end of the street. I mean, he was wearing a very particular outfit, very easy to spot, but he was just gone. For years, I haven't been able to sleep well, because whenever I start closing my eyes, I see just for a few moments many stretched out black humanoid shadows all around my room. Then I wake up and this keeps happening over and over until I finally pass out and sleep for a couple of hours. It always comes with a sensation in my chest or inside of me that's hard to explain, like a mix between pain and a sort of wish sound or a force inside of my body, warning me that this is about to happen and that I need to stay awake, even if I haven't slept before, if I don't want to suffer the consequences, that is. Whenever I try to ignore this feeling, stronger and worse things happen too. I've crossed that line 3 times and they were so intense that I don't ever want to experience it again. That's why I almost never sleep now. I started sleeping facing the wall, fully covered up to my head so that I couldn't see anything, and that worked for a while. Until one night, I felt a large hand with long nails, very cold, slowly touching me from the top of my head down to my back, and then it disappeared. I was horrified, counted to 3, jumped up, turned on all the lights, checked the whole room, and there was nothing. Strange thing though is that I sleep on just a mattress, so there's really nowhere under the bed for anyone to hide, which means that I don't really know where that hand came from. The second time I was lying on my back with my arms crossed, and for just a millisecond as I woke up, I saw a black humanoid figure squatting on my chest, staring directly at me. It didn't have eyes, but I knew that it was looking at me because its whole body was bent forward toward me. And the third time just happened this morning. Again, I was lying on my back. I try to sleep on my side so that this doesn't happen, but somehow I always end up turning onto my back while I sleep. I felt a weight on my bed like somebody sat down, and then my blanket was slowly pulled off of my face, gently, as if somebody was uncovering me in a kind and careful way. Then I felt a kiss on my cheek near my neck. At first, I thought it was my mother. I mean, she used to wake me up like that when I was a kid. But suddenly, that kiss turned into like a suction, like a hickey, so strong that I immediately stopped thinking that it was her. It hurt so much that I had to count to 3 to force myself up, even though my body was still half asleep. I stayed alert, looking around. Then I heard my mum on the rooftop, and I realized that it hadn't been her at all. All of this happened because I ignored the warning feeling in my chest that I mentioned earlier, the one that tells me that you have to stop sleeping now, like a sign that if I don't, things like this will happen. I looked online and the closest thing that I could find was exploding head syndrome, but that doesn't explain the other stuff that happens to me. Like one time I searched tutorials on how to fall asleep. There was a military method about holding your breath and relaxing to sleep in 5 minutes. I tried it in the dark with my eyes closed, and I felt a very loud noise aimed at me, as if it entered my body, along with a white light that I could see even with my eyes closed. It made me open my eyes immediately, and I let out a loud gasp, and I turned the lights on and couldn't sleep again. So I have no way to fall asleep. And every time that I feel that warning, I have to just get up, even if I've only slept for like an hour. I don't know if anyone feels what I feel, but an important detail is that if I sleep with someone else in the same room, not necessarily the same bed, but none of this ever happens, and I can sleep as long as I want. And right now I feel like I only have 3 choices. Don't sleep, this is normally what I do, until I just pass out really, and ignore the warning and seeing how far I can go, even if this stuff happens. I am scared though that it could be too strong and I won't be able to handle it. I don't know where the limit is, to be honest. Or sleeping accompanied. I don't want to do this because I don't want to bother my family, but honestly, I'm really not sure what to do anymore. Has anyone else ever felt something like this? Do you have any advice on how I can sleep or what this could be that would help a lot? I just really want to feel safe sleeping again. So I'm located in Akron, Ohio, in the US. This happened in maybe 2022 or 2023. I cannot exactly remember the year. I had just gotten home though from working late one night. I used to test gas stations and would work late into the night most times. I got home at around 2:45 to 3 a.m. and let my dogs out to go potty. And when I was standing out there, I got the overwhelming sensation to peek around the corner of my house towards my neighbors. So I just barely peeked around the side of my house and looked into their backyard, and saw something that truly freaked me out, like the worst feeling that I've ever experienced to date. For context, it was late into the night and it was a dark night that night. Maybe a crescent moon or even a new moon, but either way it was very dark outside. I had stepped back out with my dogs to get my stuff out of my work truck, and while they did their business, I set my stuff inside the side door of my house and walked back outside to see them. After they finished up, I let them back inside, but before I could follow them, I got such an overwhelming feeling that I had to look around that corner of my house to my neighbors, and I didn't know why, but I just felt compelled to do it, so I just barely peeked my head around and saw this creature standing inside of my neighbor's fenced-in backyard. It was standing at the back of the yard facing towards the woods behind our houses, so it had its back towards my neighbor's house and I was looking at its side profile. It stood maybe 6 to 7 feet tall, pale white skin, but was like bright like a light was shining on it. But again, it was pitch black outside. I could see it perfectly though, like I'd shined a flashlight on it. It was very human-like, except it had no clothes on and was muscular but smooth. And while it's a bit of an inappropriate description, I could see it from head to toe, and it had no genitalia, just a smooth body, bright pale skin, and was just standing there, staring into the woods. As I was staring at this, just in absolute disbelief and shock at what I was seeing, while still hiding behind my house essentially, it suddenly snapped its head towards me and stared directly at me. And at that stage, I didn't have any other thoughts in my head apart from run. In a full panic, I ran inside of my house, slammed the door behind me and locked it, just waiting for whatever this creature was to come and get me. I have never felt fear like I did in that moment. I truly thought it was going to come and get me and take me or kill me or something. But thankfully, I didn't see it again, and I've never seen anything like that before or since then. So, in summary, it was 6 to 7 feet tall, bright pale white skin, muscular but smooth body, completely naked but no clear genitalia. It stood staring into the woods inside the fenced-in backyard at the edge of the yard fence. Didn't make any movements besides to snap its face towards me. And the closest thing that I can find online to what it reminds me of is the creature from Prometheus. But it's still not the same at all. So, if anyone has any ideas or thoughts, then I am really all ears. I would love to know what this was, or even have a theory as to what it may have been. I have been hesitant to share this, but now that I'm out of there, I really want to share these 3 experiences with all of you, and have you decide if it was really paranormal or maybe something else. I was playing Minecraft one day on my Xbox 360, playing on the tutorial map trying to get a grasp on console Minecraft, as I'd always been a mobile player. Anyway, as I popped into my first world and went cave exploring, I heard a scream from my parents' room. All I remember is asking my little brother what happened, and apparently a Mexican doll that we had had for who knows how long, honestly, It was in the case that it was in moved slightly, like you couldn't tell from ahead but from the side that it was obvious that it just wasn't straight anymore. It was a subtle thing, but it was definitely weird. The second incident was my family was visiting during this time, and I had to give up my room for the family member that was staying there. But I was given the small room that has a ladder that comes down and leads into the attic into a makeshift bedroom for myself. Context for the room, too, is that this room has always been cold. It doesn't matter what season it is either. It's just always cold. Anyway, while I was in my room, the suitcases that were kept in there, stacked nicely on top of each other, suddenly fell over. But here's the weird thing. It wasn't on me, but to the side of me, if that makes sense. Like, it should have fallen on me, but for some weird reason it didn't. On another occasion, I'm a bit of an introvert, so I don't get out much even when I'm visiting family in a different city. I don't party or go out or anything like that. And that night was like any other when I heard something that sounded like my name being called. Sound got closer and closer until I could definitely make out that somebody was calling my name. I looked all around, but I never could find out who it was, and in the end I called my parents crying, and I heard some noises in the house too that really terrified me, but I couldn't find anyone that was in there. On another occasion late one night, I don't remember when this actually happened, but I saw a man, or what I thought was a man, by the window. I only saw them for a moment and then they were gone, but I was certain that I saw someone out there, and I looked around again, but I never could find anyone.